So what we're seeing now is just signs. And the thing is, we have to understand and look at the signs as it being a sign of something to come. What is coming? Hi, so we are back for another live teaching. I'm so excited. We are talking about identifying the pharaohs of the time. This teaching is going to be very interesting. So I am going to do two parts to it because as I was doing the formatting everything and doing the script, this had a lot of details to it, and I think not only would it have been a long teaching, but also the first part is very important. The first couple of sections are very important to understand before we move into the case study. So with every teaching that we do, there's a case study that's always involved. We're going to start with just an overview of the or summary of the previous teaching that we did. So the previous teaching that we did was on the identifying the pharaohs. It was part 1. It was in regards to the pharaoh that was in Exodus. The case study was the pharaoh in Exodus around the time of the children of Israel. So that was the case study that we did, and so that was talking about the pharaoh coming for the promise. So I'm just going to start with the disclaimer. So with every teaching that I do, there's different research mediums and things that I use in terms of research once I gather a message or know exactly what the live teaching is going to be upon. So a lot of the research I also do cross references. So it might be pulling from business, it might be pulling from different journals and articles and scholarly journals and things like that. So there's a lot of research that kind of goes into these teachings. And then also what I do is I have a case study that usually will focus on where I'll give you an example within the teaching to kind of bring the whole teaching to something that you can think about, relate to, and kind of think on in terms of how you see it in society and things like that. So just wanted to always give that disclaimer. And then also the ultimate choice that I use as far as my medium of fact checking things is the Bible. So then you'll also hear me reference Bible scriptures. Again, you can use the preferred medium. I also in the description, when I post the live teachings on the channel, when I post the replays, I also include all of the resources and sources, and so you can feel free to look through those if you're interested more about how the research was gathered and what those research articles say. So the previous live teaching that we did was talking about the Pharaoh of the times in the book of Exodus. So that's what I used as a fact checker and also corresponding events. Now with that, I also did deep research because we kind of started with ancient Egypt and what ancient Egypt was, why they were such a prominent nation. And so for in that live teaching, we talked about how many people believe that powerful nations and countries assume their power by money, right? It's they have this great money, they have this great prominence and influence because of the money they have. But that's not how that happens. It's actually through influence. It's not necessarily who they're able to influence, it's what's influencing them. And that's kind of how we dive deep into ancient Egypt. So to understand the pharaohs of the time, you absolutely have to understand who Pharaoh is, the prominence of ancient Egypt, and then also how Pharaoh rose to become such a mighty, dominant, and authoritative leader in the world. And so in the last teaching, we talked about ancient Egypt. I went down and gave you all the facts and things about ancient Egypt so that you can understand the inner workings of ancient Egypt. I know a lot of times we see, just the aesthetics of Egypt, the pyramids and some of the cultural things, but you have to understand the context of those cultural things and why that's a part of that culture, and also why that's a part of their identity culturally, but also when you talk about governance, when you talk about certain things that they had and they did. So you really have to understand that. In order to understand Pharaoh, you have to understand what Pharaoh is, who Pharaoh is, and also in connection to Egypt, ancient Egypt, what Pharaoh is and how that was established. So Egypt was skilled in war. They stewarded their overflow, had storage cities where there was an abundance. They also invented a lot of things. They they had tactical military defense, and also was a leader when it comes to agriculture and trade, and it was deemed a powerful dynasty. Now, their agriculture and trade was by the Nile, and I kind of went into the Nile, what it was, how it tied into Pharaoh and civilization back then. But also behind their administration, behind their technical defenses, their riches, their skilled professionals, their inventors, there was a very complex religious system that defined the nation's identity. And that was revered as the source of their strength and also empowered the office of Pharaoh. So I know that we hear like the Sphinx and the Anubis and like all of these like etymological or deities that they talk about when it comes to ancient Egypt. Those all have a purpose and a symbolism, and we kind of talked about in the live teaching about how complex their religious system was, how it was inundated, how it became the identity of Egypt, how, you know, Pharaoh was used, because Pharaoh is not just the man that sits on the throne that's mighty. That's with anything. Like, I think a lot of people kind of see the forerunning person within an office, within a powerful nation, and they think, oh, like, this is so-and-so, or like this is a powerful person, but it's really the office that they sit in. So they're only really seating in a seat of authority. They're not really the authority. And behind that office, there is administration. Behind that office, there are complex systems and things in place to ensure that that seat of authority, that office is held, one, in a dominant field, and then also that the authority continues to perpetuate even after that leader has passed on. So that's kind of like how Pharaoh was, where that one Pharaoh would die, his son would pick up. So it's kind of like the patriarchy mixed in there. But now when you look at dynasties aren't just familial, right? Where it's one specific family, one specific bloodline being and dominance and authorities for centuries and decades. Like, no, now it's groups of people. Now it's more so groups of people or people in authority coming together and forming, I can't even think of the word, but like forming an organization that's dominating across industries, and that's dominating for years across industries, and that's also expanding, right? And so based on this complex religious systems, it actually uplifted and gave the power of Pharaoh to become a calculated, intricate, and oppressive system that seeks to devour still identities and smite any word of truth outside of the religious text and worship given to over the 2,000 deities that they served. So when we talk about Pharaoh, again, it's a seat, it's an office, it's a seat of authority, but Pharaoh as a whole, when you look at it from a systemic point of view, it is a system. It's a system. It's actually a very intricate institution, and all an institution is like very high level, intricate systems that come and form together that create an institution that kind of perpetuates and propels whatever their narrative, whatever they seek to do forward. That's pretty much what it is. But Pharaoh is a system. It's a system of oppression. It's a system that seeks to take, that seeks to, when I say smite, like grab, that seeks to drain and destroy. And so the case study was Pharaoh in Exodus when it came to the children of Israel and how he dealt harshly with them. Now, that specific case study also, I researched it across all ancient texts, other researchers and scholars that have done this work and have been trying to put the dots together to see which Pharaoh was it, because there's so many Pharaohs, right, within the dynasty, but they were trying to see which Pharaoh was it, what Pharaoh rose to power, things like that. And so even with my research, the scholarly journals, they also reference the Bible. So a lot of these I don't even know what to call them, but professionals that this is their living. They do this research. They, take historical context and historical things and seek deep answers about the things about it, how it works, and then they use different religious texts to kind of iron out the details to see if, like even the people at archaeological sites, when they're going to dig and excavate these places, I've even did some research on that, and they use the Bible as a context of like, okay, well, the Bible says this, and so is this adding up to what we're seeing at this archaeological site? So there's a lot of different texts and things like that, but pretty much what it is the system of Pharaoh is coming to destroy. It's coming with harsh, oppressive systems, and we can even see the system of Pharaoh at work even within our society now. We might not identify it as a system of Pharaoh, but when you really look into the intricacies and also dive into the live teaching that we did last couple weeks ago, and then this live teaching, you'll really see Pharaoh reflected in a lot of what we're seeing now. And so to close off the recap of the previous live teaching, it just kind of wanted to have a reminder that ancient Egypt and Pharaoh are symbols of how religion is tied to governance. And based on the religion is going to determine the type of governance structure that you operate under and also within a territory. So for ancient Egypt, they had over 2,000 deities. That's a lot of that's a lot of deities. That's a lot of rituals. That's a lot of obeying, worshiping, being observant of different holidays and different things like that. And so, yeah, due to that complex religious system, it was directly tied to the type of governance they had, the type of authority that they had, how they rise to prominence and was such a great nation, right? Around the world, every language, every culture knew of Egypt, knew of its prominence, knew of its wealth, knew of its riches, knew of its of everything that it had and the power that it had. And so in any religion, it is tied to governance in any kind of way. It doesn't matter what you want to look at it or how you want to look at it. If you're looking at some type of governance, you have to determine what religion is tied to this, what traditions, what religious practices and or practices of worship is tied to this. That determines the type of governance structure that you operate under. And within a territory, it also determines the operational aspects of governance that happens operationally and how things are, sorted, administration and things like that. And then it also determines how the money flows, who can rise to power, and how they can rise to power. And so this last teaching kind of highlighted these contexts about what dynasties also look like within the modern world, because when we look at Pharaoh in ancient Egypt, that was a specific time, that was a specific place. Even though Egypt is still prevalent and they're still a prevalent country, what ancient Egypt and also just nations and dynasties look like back then is exactly the same. It's just more modernized. And so in the modern world where there's technology and all these things, it's kind of hard to sift through, and it kind of makes history look like, oh, we're far past that. We're not repeating history, but we actually are. And a lot of our systems, even within today, are repeating history in ways that we can't recognize because of the modern appeal, the modern words that are being used. But when you look down at the layers of it, you begin to see what's really being revealed, and it's the same systems. So that's the recap of our live teaching that we did with the first identifying of the pharaohs, with the case study of Pharaoh in Exodus. And just the first part of Exodus, it was Exodus chapter 1. So I just want to be clear about that, because there's different parts of Pharaoh that we're going to get to. So this identifying the pharaohs, there's a lot of different parts. I believe this is a series. I know that it is because there's so many parts. There's so many pharaohs, and they all stand for different things. They happen at different times. And so that's what this live teaching is going to teach you about, understanding the pharaohs of the time, what the pharaoh is, who Pharaoh is, why they're rising to power, why are they in power, what's the purpose. And there's different pharaohs for different things, right? And so this live teaching, we are going to talk about the pharaohs that are coming to acquire your promise and derail destinies. And so this is the pharaoh of greed that's coming to ravish the remnant. And so this is also tied into greed, sex, and lies, right? So those are the top 3 themes within this teaching, is greed, sex, and lies. Now, before we even kind of get into the case study, because our case study is going to be about Pharaoh and Abraham, and so I will break that down. But that specific case study will be I will be going live this Sunday to do it again, because what I'm about to tell you when we're about to talk about the remnants is going to take most of this section and most of this teaching. And so I'll get into like the actual case study and breaking down Pharaoh and Abraham and that specific time in history. And even though Abraham was in Egypt for a very temporary, very short amount of time, that exchange and what was happening is very key, and brings so much revelation. And so that's going to happen on Sunday, though. Sunday at 4:30 p.m. Or actually, I'm sorry, Sunday at 5 p.m. PST time. So I'm going to do that this Sunday because, yeah, this remnants part is going to take a while, because I do want to take my time in highlighting what's and setting the stage for how this is, what it's come to be, like just to help you really understand. So we're going to talk about, in here, we're going to talk about the remnants part, because if this is the Pharaoh of greed, right? Which every Pharaoh, there is greed, and there's underlying greed attached to it, and also pride. So that's a given. But this specific Pharaoh, through this specific time and this specific situation, and also in relation to, again, Abraham being temporarily in Egypt at a time where there was famine, and just what that Pharaoh at that time that he encountered was doing, is this is definitely the Pharaoh where greed was at the epicenter, like it was at its highest, right? And this Pharaoh was coming to ravish the remnants. So we're going to start with what remnants are. Let me just, I didn't bring my mouse, that's why. I was like, why does this feel kind of weird? I forgot my mouse. Okay, so remnants. So we're going to start with the definition of remnants. So this is 2-part definition. So I'm going to give you like what Webster's and all these other dictionaries say, and then I'm going to actually give you the Hebrew, because it is a Hebrew word, the Hebrew word from the concordance, and kind of tell you more about that so that you can understand. So this first part of this teaching is to really set the stage about what remnants are, because I think when I say it, or even like when I thought about it and when I was rereading my notes, I was like, okay, yeah, remnants, I know what remnants are. And then it was like, okay, but like help me make sense of like what that is, and also like what that looks like in life today. And so that's kind of what these teachings are, is like to show you these historical contexts, to take it, break it down to the deepest level, and then also relate it back to something that you can kind of see in this time, because this teaching, though it's happening at this time in this season, you can literally apply this and look at this through any season of your life, and also going forward, and be able to identify these things, and just so that you know what's going on, so that you can be better equipped to make the best decision. And also we talk about in these live teachings, it's to help bring like moral courage, sometimes even civil disobedience, because it's like so many things are normalized in society that should not be normalized, and we have become so desensitized to it that we just, okay, whatever. But that's the thing, like, no, it is time to take and be of moral courage, to have some civil disobedience, and to stand up and say no. And so this is also kind of with these Pharaoh teachings and all the live teachings that I've done. You can check the replays on the page. They're to show you like where we are lacking when it comes to our authority, where we are lacking when it comes to standing in the gap. When we talk about social justice and things like that, also with my consulting firm, before I get into the teaching, as a side note, I forgot who I was talking to, or I was writing it down for something. Oh, my copywriter. And I was telling her that most people think that social justice, when we talk about justice with climate justice, all these things, when we talk about social issues and the justice for these social issues and disparities, we're always talking from a lens of that it's somebody else's issue to deal with. Like, it's somebody's issue to deal with this. I don't have the money, or I don't have the time, when actually, no, it's our responsibility to deal with these things. We have the voice and we have the power. And so really, it's really just acclimating and getting you to dig deeper and assess, like, where have you fallen short? Where have you allowed things, even within your day-to-day, to kind of continue to go on without using your voice, without standing in the gap for these social issues, for these injustices? And so this is what these teachings are helping you to see. Like, we talk about, I see on social media, and I'm not on it a lot, because I just don't have the time, and I like unplugging a lot. So yeah, we are on social media, but when I get on social media, when I do finally get on and I see like people complaining about all these things, it's like, okay, but what are you doing about it? Yes, you might not have the power to march to the Capitol or have access to the president, but like there's something that you could be doing within your sphere of influence, within your community, that will change that. And so that's what these teachings are to do, is to like stir up some moral courage. Like we are sitting back and relaxing and just going with the flow, and allowing our authority, allowing our purposes, our destinies, allowing just even our livelihood and the right that we have to a peaceful and safe livelihood to just be diminished, to be desecrated, to just be taken advantage of. And it's like, have we forgot who we are? Have we forgot we have power? Have we forgot the power in our voice? Have we forgot the power of, like, when you stand with conviction and firmness to something, what happens, what shifts, what changes? So even in these case studies that I'm showing you, what happens when one person that might be deemed the bottom of the totem pole, the lower, the lesser, the underdog, if you want to call it, like, what happens when they stand in the conviction of what they know is true and what they know is something of their responsibility, how things shift and change. And so let me not get into that, because we can go into that a lot, but that's kind of what I do in my day-to-day work with my consulting firm, is handling and tackling these issues and these systems. A lot of what I'm able to do with these live teachings and how I'm able to break it down in this way is really just how my brain thinks. So it's a God-given gift, but also because I've had so many years of administration. I've had so many years doing systemic work that I really didn't understand. Like, I knew that I was doing systemic work and working with systems, creating systems, developing systems that didn't exist, putting them, within organizations or within corporate areas that are full of calamity, and trying to tweak those systems, you know what I mean, and get people, like, there's just so much people in change management that I was doing for years that I didn't really know I was doing until I came into the knowledge of it, and really also had some people speak into my life about, like, yeah, like, this is a thing, and this is how you're doing it, and this is what you're doing. And so it kind of brought clarity to that. And so, yeah, I've done a lot of systemic work for a long time in the most indirect ways, but still impactful ways. And so that's how I'm able to actually see these kind of systemic things. And systems are backed by business. So when we talk about governance is backed by money, which is backed by economics. And so they're all intertwined. And so that's something, all the things that I've studied when I went to business school. And so when you begin to, like, put things together and look behind what you see, and really dig into the details, you're actually able to kind of just track everything and connect the dots. So I think that's also why I'm kind of good at accounting, because with accounting, like, you can look at numbers and the numbers are showing you something, right? When you look at data, like when you have people that are in a debate and they're giving you data and statistics, a lot of people take data and statistics for face value, but there's so many elements, there's so many complexities, there's so many layers to how that data became. A lot of times also they're only really doing surveys in a certain sector, in a certain area. Like, there's so many complex and layers. So when you actually take data and look at data or look at numbers and ask yourself, okay, what is this data telling me? I know what I'm seeing at face value, but then what are other complex and other layers that made this data be or reflect what it's reflecting? And then once you also know just the back end of how it was done, how the survey was facilitated, how they gathered, like, when you know those kind of back end details that I know that a lot of people think, and I hear and see people say, like, oh, well, I don't want to do all that, or they just kind of shut their brains off to it because they feel like it's so much work. But actually in that work is when you have the most clarity, and you're also able then to make very concise, very direct decisions, because you actually have all the details. And right now we're not making decisions based off having the clear details and the clear context. We're making decisions off of emotions based on what we're seeing for face value. And that's the issue. And that's also why things aren't working. That's also why these systems are falling, because we're in a time now where it's time for these systems to fall. They have been in operation for centuries. I mean, centuries, decades, generations. I mean, going back to the times that we read about and hear about in history books, these systems have been around. So it's time for them to fall. The thing is we're taking everything for face value, and we're kind of getting emotional about the things that are happening. But when a system is constructed and when a system is deconstructed, it's going to have the same impact. Same thing of, like, if there's a city and the city needs a bridge, right? Okay, well, in constructing the bridge, there are going to be pros and cons to the building of the bridge. Someone is going to suffer. It's going to inconvenience someone, even though a bridge is being built. And from the face value of it, it's a bridge. The city needed the bridge. This could help everyone. This could help the flow of traffic. Yeah, but in some way of where the bridge is positioned, the land that the bridge is taking up, like, it's going to impact people in different ways. It's the same thing with systems. Every system, every law that goes forth, the laws that go forth are for governance, and governance is governed by economics. Economics is just the flow of money and the flow of development, the flow of money that gives development for things for a return on money, and it's also based on the psychology of how people move, how people do things, how people buy, how people purchase. You take all of that and then you develop something that then brings a return on your investment. That's pretty much what it is. And then it's all governed by politics. So that's what politics is. That's what laws are. Law is just a form of governance. And so when we talk about these systems, yeah, these systems are falling. And yes, there's people suffering. But my thing is, those people were already suffering with the systems in place. So when you think about and look at like these movies and how the climax is, okay, there's people suffering and then the hero comes. Okay, the hero comes, does great things. However, there is still cons. Any way you look at it, if someone's going to suffer, someone's going to be impacted. And so that's the whole point of looking at things from a deeper lens and looking at the context. And so that's what I'm bringing you, is the context. You got to look at it from the full context, because then you can understand, and then we can make better decisions. Because right now I feel like a lot of the decision making is based off of emotions, and emotions get you nowhere. So I don't even know how I got on all that, but I think that's important to know. And that's just someone who's in systemic work. I've worked with so many people and so many agencies, and I see the same thread of, it's almost like I'm coming across the same thread of people, but it's not really the people, it's really the mindset, and the mindset stems from systemic things. And those systemic structures have then built root systems. And so what I'm seeing is the roots of those systems being embedded in people that then forge these same mindsets and ways of thinking that also hinder progression, that also hinder things moving forward, that also hinder all the things that are supposed to happen from happening. So that's just my little spiel with systemic work and how this relates to these life teachings, and like how I'm illustrating and bringing all this to you. It's actually pretty fun work. I don't know if anyone's done accounting or just in numbers in general. It's checks and balances. Everything within this world is checks and balances. So if something is not adding up on one side, well, something adds up on one side and the other side is not adding up, then you know, okay, well, let me look and see what's going on, because this should be adding up. And so then it's just finding the numbers, tweaking the numbers, putting this here, looking through this. It's like, it's fun work when you know what to do. And sometimes you don't even know what to do, but just in doing and just starting, like, okay, well, I'm just going to start here. It's like things begin to just open up, and then you begin to just kind of sort and find your way through. So that's kind of what these live teachings are. I'm just bringing it to you, allowing, if you don't know where to start, if you're feeling, even just, a lot of people are feeling fearful, stuck, stagnated. They feel sad. I mean, some people are grieving, right, with what's going on. So even if you're feeling all of those things, just listening to these teachings will not only give you that hope, but it'll just expose you. Because a lot of people say, well, I don't know where to start. Just listen to the teachings. That's where you start. And when you start and listen and truly listen, what I'm saying will begin to open up to you. You'll begin to see it from different levels, different angles. You'll be able to see it in your life. You'll be able to just know, and then you'll be able to know what to do. Now, then it's up to you to actually do what you're supposed to do, and you know what you're supposed to do. Like, I can tell you things to do and what to do, but it's up to you to decide if you want to do it, if you want to take a stand, if you want to sacrifice. Because everything comes with sacrifice. Nothing is free. Okay? So we're going to get back into the teaching. I don't even know where that came from, but I feel like it needs to be said. So it's said. We're going to get back into the teaching. Okay. So we're going to talk about remnants. And And when we talk about this specific Pharaoh, is the Pharaoh that is the Pharaoh of greed. I'm talking about greed to a whole new level. I mean, all of them are greedy, because that's what a system of Pharaoh is. It's built on greed and pride. But this one, for this specific situation in this case study, is very greedy. But he's coming not just for what's within the land, he's coming to ravish the remnants. And so remnants, so the first definition of remnants through dictionaries is usually a small part, a member or trace of something that's remaining. It's a small surviving group. It's maybe an unsold or unused piece of goods. It's something that's still remaining, a small remaining quantity of something. Or they gave a biblical context, which is a small minority of people who will remain faithful to God and so be saved. And they also related it to the prophecies concerning Israel, which that's where we're at. So it's perfect. And the relative scripture that they gave for that in terms of the dictionary was Genesis 45:7, where it says that this is when Joseph had revealed his identity to his family after they had sold him into slavery, right? And he had found favor with Pharaoh. And so Joseph was used to preserve, like his life being preserved was critical, because at that time, and that's another, I got into it a little bit in the other live teaching, but that's another identify Pharaoh teaching. But at this time, because Abraham relates to Joseph, they're all within the same lineage, and I break that down. Coming up in the next section. And his life needed to be saved because there was a famine that was going to be for 7 years. And it was critical for everything that happened to him to happen so that he found favor with Pharaoh and was put in a position of authority that then allowed him to save his lineage, as his lineage, the children of Israel, is the remnant, right? And so now we get into remnant. So the Hebrew, from the concordance, it's called shay-ay-reeth. That's what remnant is, shay-ay-reeth. It means remnant, remainder, residue, and residual. It originates from sha'ar, which means to remain, be left over, survive, leave, let, reserve, and the rest. Some of the other definitions was something that had escaped, or something that was left, something that remained or was the remainder. Another one was saying survivor, those who had escaped. And so there was a concept in theological core definition that kind of brings together these definitions, and it said that shay-ay-reeth signifies the remaining part, a remnant preserved by God when judgment or calamity sweeps through the nation. So this term moves beyond the residue, arithmetic residue, to express covenantal faithfulness, what endures because the Lord chooses to keep it alive. Thus the word then becomes, which is remnant, becomes a thread that ties together divine justice, mercy, threatening, and promise. And so when you think about remnant, a lot of questions came to mind, right, about remnant. And when we talk about these definitions that I just gave, like what's remaining, what's the remainder, what's the residue, what's the residual, what was left, what survived, what was kept alive. Ask yourself these questions. What is your remnant? Whose remnant are you a part of? Because it can also be lineage. Like I said, it's a group of people, so it could probably be lineage. It could probably be generational. Maybe it's a specific organization or something has become the remnant, right? What is blocking your residuals? What's sweeping up the residue of your life, right? Because remnant could also be the residue of something that's left over. That could be for, as a part of like your promise, as a part of your destiny, as a part of something that could even just, again, be generational, where it's like, yeah, your residuals and the residue that was left over from your ancestors was this plot of land or this amount of money. So like, what is sweeping up your residue that you are promised? What have you why have you been left as a part of the remaining few? If some of you might be feeling like, well, I'm the only one left that feels or that thinks or that sees things in this way. Like, why have you been left as part of the remaining few? Where's the rest? Like, where's the rest of it? What has been reserved for you? What did you survive? Who left you? And what left you? I said, what did you survive twice? Okay. And how did you escape what was meant to sell you or keep you? Now, again, this can be a group of people. It can be a generational promise or generational blessing that hasn't been fulfilled in like the present generations that you are seeing and alive to see. It can also be based on religious beliefs of the promises believed by your specific religion, because a lot of different religions and religious texts, they have different modalities and things that they believe are like their right. Like, because I'm this and because I've come into this knowledge, like this is what is my promise. This is what is subscribed to me. And then it also could be common things like good health, peace, etc. Like, what is that? So when you look at our world, when you look at society, when you look at how things are going, even where you live, where you work, where you commune with community, and a community can look like a very small group of people. It can look like 1 or 2 people. It can look like a mass, 2,000 people gathered together. But when you look at that, when you look at the world, when you look at society, when you look at your life, when you look back even through the generations, and even if you have stories of your family and the generations, and when you look back and think about those stories, where's the residue? Where's the remainder that was left for the ones, from the ones that came before us? And as the remaining few, what have you survived? And why have you been kept alive? Why are you a part of the remnant? Why has your name been forged under the list of the people needing to be kept alive, needing to survive what you've survived? Why? Have you asked yourself that? Like, why? What's threatening your remnant? So it's not just you, like you're a part of a remnant. You might be a part of a group of people. So what's threatening the people within your remnant, like your remnant as a whole? What's threatening what's been left for you to then acquire? What's threatened what was passed down to you? What's threatening the residual and the residue that was left for you as your promise? What's threatening that? And then how does divine justice and mercy play a role in what you're enduring that then will connect you to your promise, your purpose, or what has been left for you? So how does divine justice and mercy play a role in that when you ask yourself all those questions and get through those questions? And so I kind of want you to think about that as we transition into a part of the case study. So this is going to just be the first half of this case study where we kind of go further into the remnants. So I've kind of given you a lot of questions to think about, a lot of things to ponder upon. Some people might feel like, well, I don't know if I'm part of the remnant or not. Like, that's something for you to ponder on. That's something for you to think about. That's something for you to gather and sit with to see, like, are you a part of the remnant? Even if it's not generational or lineage, lineage isn't just by way of family, it's also by way of connection and community. So you could be a part of someone's lineage if someone poured into you. There's a mentor. So there's other ways of lineage and generational things being passed down outside of family. So for those that are like, maybe my family, I understand. There's other ways of generational lineage. So yeah, we're going to transition. I'm going to let you kind of sit with that a little bit. I'm going to get some water, but we're going to transition into kind of thinking more about this remnants. This is the first part of the case study because I want you to really understand generational things, lineage, and the importance of our decisions, and kind of going back into what I talked about earlier of having that moral courage, having those strong convictions, and not just having strong convictions to have strong convictions, but actually standing on them, like letting your life be a vocal about the convictions you have, and not just being like, oh, well, I mean, if they ask me, I'll tell them no. Like, what I'm about to describe to you as if how this remnant formed, and what I'm about to go into this case study with you about is is going to show and highlight the importance of having the moral courage to do when everything around you is like calamity, when everything around you is upside down, when everything around you looks so evil. Why it's not just important to just say, oh, this is what I believe, but to stand heavy foot, 10 toes down on it, but then also allow every part of your life to emulate what that is that you're saying is your conviction and your belief, and emulate loudly where it has such a vocality and a vocal ability to the things that are surrounding you, because it's so important. And that's why I'm saying, like, we have to really inspect the things that we have normalized and desensitized and just saying like, oh, well, that's just how society is, or that's just how it works, because we have inundated and taken on those identities in ways that we don't really know, because we think that, oh, because I'm not doing it, or because I don't subscribe to it, it has nothing to do with me. But that's where we're wrong, because even when it doesn't have anything to do with us, we kind of just move it on by, and that's the point. We can't just no longer just let things pass anymore, because as we see, like, they are coming for your right. They're coming for your right to speak. They're coming for your right to live and how you should live. Like, they are coming for every right that we have been given. And if we just continue to just say, oh, well, that's just how it is, that's just how politics are, that's just how governance is, or oh, well, I don't know, or I don't want to spend my time reading and knowing about that kind of stuff, yeah, you're going to fall right into whatever it is. So whatever they say that your life is going to look like and supposed to be, you're going to just fall in line with it. And even if you don't like it, you really don't have a choice, because you allowed your authority to be taken from you. Matter of fact, you just laid it down. And so this is why that moral courage, that civil disobedience, I have said it in a previous live teaching, but it's pretty much of like, when you think about the stories of people that have gone against the grain, like if you've heard stories where it's like, okay, this is what's going on, this is the decree. In the live teaching, I was talking about the decree of Pharaoh, when he was telling the midwives, like, when those Hebrew women, when they had those babies, if it's a girl baby, you'll keep it, but if it's a boy, you'll kill it, right? And they didn't kill it because they feared the Lord. They feared the Lord, the God of the Israelites, the one true living God. So they feared him so much they would not kill the boy babies. And when you think about patriarchy, everything went through the sons. And so the men held the power. And I know people get like up in arms about that, but that's just how kind of the structure was, and kind of still is, because there's a specific office and mantle that the man is commissioned to. And we'll get into that, because there's a teaching even on when it comes to the office of a man and the office of a woman, but that's some teachings for next year. But yeah, so they refuse. Now, mind you, we talked about Egyptians, they was doing human sacrifices, all the things. And so they rebelled against Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh is mighty, he's powerful. Everyone that was subjected under his control, that lived in under the territories of Egypt at that time, had to obey, and they didn't obey. So they had some civil disobedience where it was like, no, what I know to be true, what I know that I stand on, I will not do, So it's more than just, and I'm using this as an example, but it's more than just like holidays where it's like, oh, well, I don't celebrate that, so we don't do that in my house. It's more than just that. It's actually like standing up against authority. Having some civil disobedience against authority, where a decree, where a law, a legislation goes into effect, and standing up in that, and standing loud. Like those women stood loud and proud in that. That's where the civil disobedience comes in. So we are going to get into the first part of this case study. Okay, so this is part of this case study between Pharaoh and Abraham. We're going to talk more about the remnants and kind of understanding the kind of the definitions that I gave you, and like how that looks, what that looks like, how the remnant even came into formation, how the children of Israel became the remnant, like how there was a promise, like what happened, like how did this even just all happen? How do you know and can identify when there's a remnant, or you're a part of a remnant, or like, we're going to get into all that. But this part of the case study is where there's an intertwining of greed, sex, and lies, and how uncertainty can move you into a position that puts you in the direct sight of a Pharaoh whose insatiable appetite can't be fulfilled. So yeah, this is going to be so good. I'm so excited. This is going to be so good. I was working on this and I was trying not to fall out, because you know when something's so good, you're just like, oh, like, it's just so good. So here's a couple questions I'm going to answer. You don't even have to ask. I got you. So how did we get to Abraham, right? So we started with Pharaoh. The last teaching we started with Pharaoh, the children of Israel. Like, so how do we get to even Abraham in this teaching? What about Joseph? Because in the live teaching we mentioned about Joseph. What about Joseph, and how are the children of Israel related to Abraham? So how we got to Abraham is we're kind of gonna go in the order of the prompting of the Holy Spirit and how he's telling me to format these teachings. And so based on whoever tells me to do the teaching on is how we'll kind of get there, right? But the element and the core element of these teachings, specifically these Pharaoh teachings, is just exposing Pharaoh and the elements of Pharaoh. Now, the second question is, well, what about Joseph? Because you talked about Joseph in the past, the previous live teaching. You're correct. So Joseph is still a part of this narrative, and we'll kind of dive into Joseph's encounters with Pharaoh soon. But I'll tell you that Joseph is also a part of the lineage of Abraham. And so when we talk about, which is also part of the children of Israel. And so when we talk about another question of how are the children of Israel related to Abraham, and how is Joseph fitting in as a part of the children of Israel, if that's part of his lineage, I'm getting ready to break it all down for you. Okay. So I have to take you, in order to answer this question about how the children of Israel is related to Abraham, and Abraham is a part of the children of Israel, and they're all within the same lineage, and that includes Joseph, that includes Moses. How we get all of there, I have to take you back to what the remnant is, right? So Abraham was a part of the remnant that was saved by his ancestors. Now, I know you're kind of thinking like, well, why was he and his family saved? And then what were they saved from? And then who are Abraham's ancestors? I'm glad you asked. Okay, so this is where we're going to start from. I will want to give context that there's a teaching that I did called Genesis, the beginning. It was informed of going through the first 3 chapters of Genesis, showing you where modesty started, because all this ties into modesty as well, of like how the conditioning, how the systems, the oppression contorts and conforms and reworks your identity. And so even people's identity and the thoughts that they think about towards modesty aren't necessarily the correct thoughts because of the oppressive systems. But you have to identify what oppressive systems are at work to understand how they're embedding root systems that then bring about a mindset that you think that you're choosing, but you're not really choosing. It's the system choosing it for you, and you're just living it out, right? So that kind of goes into the Garden of Eden. That was the first teaching I did of like how modesty began, what happened in the Garden of Eden, like all the events. So that's where we have to go back to, is Genesis in the beginning. So from there, after, I'm not going to even go over that because that is a lot, but you can watch that live teaching. It's on the page. But I'm going to coincide and say pretty much mankind was made, and then so mankind was made, and then God made the physical body of Adam. So there was separate humans that were made. Adam and Eve were specific people chosen to have a specific type of intimacy with God. And so they were the serpent came, and the serpent pretty much deceived Eve, and they took of the fruit that they were not supposed to take from. And what he did was use the elements and the things that God created them, because even God told them, like, you know, the fruits and the trees and the beauty and things like that. So the serpent used the partiality of the truth, and also in conjunction to the physicality things that they were given to see of the fruitfulness of where they were able to dwell and eat from. into deceiving her. So they ate of the fruit. They got kicked out of the garden. God was like, respectfully leave, right? Put flaming sword, like, you know what I mean? Angels guarding with flaming swords, because what it did was it brought about the knowledge of good and evil. So this also allowed a legal right. So I don't think most people talk about this. And I know, like, in the stories, like when we were kids, the animations, they were just like, they had this snake and all this stuff like that, but they don't talk about the underlying thing of, like, this is where sin came into the world. And when we talk about sin, we talk about all the evil things and the things that happen or that are happening, right? This is also where Adam and Eve gave of legal right for that serpent, which was influenced by the enemy, by the devil, to then do whatever he wanted to do. And so this is where the knowledge of good and evil came into, like, this is where their influences within their mind and things like that, and the kind of the things that we feel and experience in life all comes back from what happened in the garden, right? So due to that fall, and also due to the legal right that was given, because when you kind of think about spiritual aspects, and I know that everyone has different spiritual beliefs, so you are more than welcome here, but when we talk about spiritual elements, it's all legalities, it's all governance. And so that's why I'm like pressing upon you that even in ancient Egypt, this governance, this beautiful, I can't call it beautiful, but this mighty nation was backed by religion. It was backed by a spiritual protocol, a type of spiritual worship and devotion. It was backed by a spiritual altar. Now, they had altars with over 2,000 deities. So that's a lot of spiritual altars. That's a lot of influence. But so what they're doing is they gave legal rights for these deities to do whatever they wanted to do in exchange for power, in exchange for governance, in exchange for becoming these mighty nations. So that's what it is. So back in the garden, when they ate of the fruit and they disobeyed when God told them not to, it's like, you could have any other tree in this garden, just don't touch this one. When they did that, it was a disobedience. What happened is, because they were in a place where Eden was a place of intimacy, true intimacy with God. I mean, you know, he's walking in the cool of the day, like his presence is there in a way of intimacy where, like it's like the realest, like, epicenter of intimacy that you can get. And so it also was a position in the spirit. So they had a certain position and authority. And like when you read Genesis and you see like what he told them to do, how he told them to do it, he was giving them orders, but it just wasn't orders. It was commandments, but it was also mandates. And with those mandates came the authority for them to do that. And how they were able to do that was through the creative expression of the word of God that already spoke over their lives when he formed their spirit before he formed their body. We can get into that another teaching. Let me know if you want me to drop that, because I can get deep into that. However, so when they did that, I'm just trying to set it for you like military terms. So they were like high in the spiritual realm. Like when you think about military, they're a high rank. Like, so what they did was when they disobeyed, they lost their rank. And they gave over, they literally handed over their authority to the enemy. To the snake, which was influenced by the enemy that had fell out of heaven. So when that happened, it gave the enemy legal rights to do whatever he wanted to do, however he wanted to do it. And so that's why when you read on the Bible, there's so much stuff going on. There's giants in the land. There's just all this stuff. All these people just doing crazy stuff. So after that happened, it got real, right? They were kicked out. They had Cain and Abel. Abel was killed by his brother Cain. Like it just started getting real. Okay, so then all this, they got into this giants where the angels the fallen angels, the fallen deities, and the fallen spiritual beings were procreating with the women. They were creating these big giants, and it was crazy, right? So pretty much there was so much evil on the world, like all the evil things that you can probably think of, don't think about them. But just saying that we see it was just at a whole nother level. And so God was like, absolutely not. But mind you, even before that happened, and I have to get the exact scripture, so I have to remind myself, but the thing is, God knew all this was going to happen before it happened. And so that's why there is a remnant. That's why there is a promise tied to the remnant. And this is why we get into the children of Israel, because before they fell, God already knew Adam and Eve was going to fall. That's why he already had a plan in place to send his son Jesus. Now, his son Jesus Christ needed to come, but he needed to come through a pure lineage, because Jesus is pure. He is holy. And he is a part of God. And so he needed a lineage, a clean lineage, a lineage that was faithful to the commandments that God has set on the earth, for Jesus to come through that lineage. So that's where the remnant comes, because he had chosen a certain people to be that of his remnant, that would be faithful to him, that would be grounded in his word, that would follow and obey the commandments and obey the lifestyle, because it was a specific lifestyle, right? And I'll kind of get into all the things that were kind of going on at that time, and all the crazy things that were happening even within the family unit and the generations. But as long as there was a lineage, as long as there was someone within that lineage, that's what kept the promise going. And that is what became of the remnant. So that's how the remnant came. Now, when you talk about, well, why did Abraham need to be saved? Again, after the fall, it was crazy, right? And so God swept the earth. There was a big flood. Now, if you look at, and I've actually researched a lot of different cultural texts and religious texts, in every different culture, they all talk about, they call it the reset, right? They don't want to call it the flood. Some of them actually speak to there being actual floods, but they call it like a reset. That's like the term that all the cultures use. There was a reset, and it's all around like kind of the same time period. And so if you just relate that back to the Bible, it was the flood. So that's when he flooded the earth, killed everybody, but he left Noah, because Noah was found favorable in God's eyes. Now, again, these people, and I want to preface by saying these aren't perfect people, right? We're only made perfect through Christ. These aren't perfect people. And so, however, Noah found favor in God's eyes, where he also was looking. It says the Spirit, God was looking, searching for a man, right? So he was looking for someone that was faithful, that was found favorable in his eyes, and that was living according to his laws, to be able to use that man's lineage, use his family, use the generations to come to bring forth the son of Jesus Christ. So when the flood came, Noah was saved, his family was saved, right? But all the other humanity was destroyed. And some animals were saved, but everything else was destroyed, right? And so I'm going to show you from Noah, how we got from Noah down to Abraham, okay? And so Noah died when he was 950 years old. Now, at this time, they was living long. There was like such a vitality of human vitality, like they was living long lives. So Noah didn't die till he was 950 years old. But so after the flood, because Noah had like his sons with him, his wife, and then the animals, and I think his sons had wives. So Noah's son Shem, in text, they deem him as the oldest son, just because his name's always mentioned first. So it's called like the law first mentions, like the person that's always mentioned first is like, that's really the most important, prominent person. And then also, so some texts deem him as the oldest son. I'm not sure if that's the case, but he was chosen by God. And also Noah had gave Shem a blessing, because after the flood or whatever, Noah had fell asleep, whatever. He was a little bit drunk from the wine, fallen asleep, and one of his sons it says like looked upon his nakedness. I'm not even going to get into that, but pretty much Shem and his other brother covered their father. And so when Noah woke up, he gave a specific blessing to Shem. And so Shem was like, from that blessing chosen, like the lineage that would come out of him was chosen, right? And so he also became the father of all Hebrews. And so they call them Semitic people, because they weren't just one culture, or they were part of the Assyrians. So his lineage was the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Amalekites, the Armenians, and the Israelites who we're talking about. And so Shem means name or renown. It was 2 years after the flood that he became a father at 100 years old. And so he gave birth to Arpachshad. And there's not really a cultural significance, or like I would say a meaning and significance to Arpachshad. And you'll see this a lot within the lineage. So I'm getting ready to go through the lineage to show you how we got from Noah, how we got from the fall, destruction on the earth. Noah was saved, Noah's lineage, because he found favor down. Now the lineage that comes out of Noah will be used, and Noah is part of the remnant that was saved, right? And so I'm going to go through the lineage of who within the family based on, the son, and it all came from the son, right? So again, like, that's just what it was. It came from the son. So what son was chosen, and through the lineage and the children that he had, what son was chosen out of that lineage to then carry it on. And so what I'm doing is I'm telling you their name. And I looked up the Hebrew, like what it means in Hebrew, and some of like the genealogy, the references, what their names mean, because as I was going through this and was instructed by the Holy Spirit to do it, and to like look up the names and what the names mean. The names mean something. The names also have a significance, because when you talk about generations, I believe there was 10 generations in between Noah and Abraham. And so, but each generation, each pillar, each lineage, each patriarch, because they're all called patriarchs. So each patriarch, which is a man that was chosen, and his lineage that was chosen to continue this faithfulness, to continue this covenant, and to continue this remnant, the preservation of the remnant. It means something, and even it means something. So that's why I'm going to taking you through this, and this is going to make sense. And then for the people that the patriarchs, where there wasn't necessarily a definition or like a root word of their name, there's still meaning to that, because we'll get into that later. So Arpachshad had Shalak. So Shalak was named a part of the genealogy as a patriarch, right? I also looked at some of the root words for the name in comparison, because when I just looked at Shalak, there wasn't much. But when I looked, or Shalah, sorry. But Shalak comes from Shalak, and Shalak means sent, send, and sending. Then the origin of the name means to send away, for, or out of. He lived during the Tower of Babel. So now, mind you, there was a lot of them, right? So in this, they're pretty much this lineage, because most of them had kids. Like they had 3, 4, 5 kids. Like they had kids, but one son was chosen out of each family. So the rest of their family was just out doing whatever. A lot of them was into idolatry. So a lot of worship of a lot of deities. I mean, they was just doing some crazy things. And so the Tower of Babel, if you don't know the story, I'm just going to give a quick synopsis, is pretty much a part of Noah's family. And mind you, Noah is still on the earth at this time while all this is happening. He lived to 950 years old. And actually in my research, I know I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but in my research, I found that Noah and Shem lived when Abraham was alive. So I think Abraham got, like, I think they said Abraham, I'll have to go back to my research because it's in another notepad area, but I think they said like Abraham had like 39 years with Noah before he died, and then I can't remember how many years he had with Shem. So they all were still like on the earth. Like Noah hadn't died yet. Noah got to see Abraham, like, you know what I mean? So I was just like, what? Because the thought just popped in my head, like, so was Noah still alive? Was Shem still alive to see Abraham, like, which his name was Abram, but like, was Abraham being born? And yes, they all were still alive on the earth. And actually, you'll also see, I don't know if I put it in here, but throughout the lineage, throughout the generation, because the Lord definitely was like, okay, the heart of man will always be evil. And so he kind of cut the vitality of their life down to like only 120 years. So you'll kind of see the progression where like they, were living as long as Noah was living, and then some, like, even to 300, 500 years, and then, like, it slowly decreased, right? And that's kind of also part of it. So at this time, the Tower of Babel, which is still Noah, Shem, like all of their adjacent, I'm just mentioning again the patriarch, but they did have other children. Like Noah had other children, Arpachshad had other children, Shalach had other children. So they was pretty much decided, like, okay, well, we're gonna settle at this place, right? And it didn't really have like a necessarily an origin, so it was just like this place that they decided they was gonna settle into and build up a city. So they was like, boom, we're gonna build up a city, and we are going to build a tower. So they were took like the brick and stuff, or refined it and made it strong, and they're like, we're gonna build this tower all the way up to the heaven. Now, in my head, I'm like, why would they do that? Like, who just wants to build a tower to heaven, to get into heaven? Now, in the Bible, it says, and of course, I'm giving you summary, so you can go back and check it. But in the Bible, it pretty much said that, like, God was talking to, pretty much like, he was talking to himself, but like, you know, the Holy Spirit and Jesus. So he was talking with among himself and saying, like, they will surely, like, if we let this continue, they will surely build a tower that will reach heaven. So that's why it's called the Tower of Babel, because it was God interceded, and he scattered them and scattered their language. So because at this point in the earth, they were talking one language. I did some research. They all were talking one language. Linguistic and cultural was one. Now that they did have different tribes, but as far as language, linguistic wise, they were under all one language. But when the Tower of Babel happened, God interceded and was like, absolutely not. They're not about to do this, because if they actually do it, they will achieve it, which also speaks to going back into, again, even though that what happened in the Garden of Eden, that legal right, again, gave access to good and of evil. And so even the perpetuating thoughts of men were still evil even after the flood, right? Because the enemy still had legal right on the earth, if that makes sense, until Jesus came. So yeah, so that's what happened at the Tower of Babel. So Shalach, Shem, Noah, they watching their relatives go out and build a Tower of Babel. Now, when this happened, and shortly after the Tower of Babel happened, the longevity of humanity declined. And this also kind of set the stage, Shalach set the stage for what the remnant would be called. And so it also talked about how Shalach was meaning the dispatching or commissioning of a person, a word, object, or action. So Shalach, really his generation meant the sending out, to send away. And it also was releasing or allowing departure. So when the Tower of Babel happened, there was clearly a departure, right? They were all scattered. I mean, their language was scattered. So that's when linguistics and the different forms of linguistics of language came about, because their language was scattered, right? And they couldn't understand each other anymore. That was the purpose, because they were all under one tongue, one language, they were able to understand and be able to identify and communicate with each other. But now when the language was scattered, now they can't really understand and identify with each other. And so Shalach, he meant the stretching out of the hand or instrument, often an act of power, and conveying the divine initiative behind every authentic mission. So again, this is a part of the remnant. This is the precursor of how the remnant of people were kept, right, and survived, and how this promise, right, how when you talk about the residuals and the residue and the promise and the remnant that brings forth the purpose, that brings forth the things that you've been wanting, that you've been waiting for, how it's preserved through generations. So Shalach was that of the sending out. He was the sending out generation. And it says Shalach also is the root of Shiloach, which is a fountain in Jerusalem. And the fountain of Jerusalem was also called later Siloam. And it says that the pool of Shelah, which was later called Siloam, lay at the southern eastern spur of the city of David. Now, David is a part of this remnant, and he's later on down the lineage. It gets wild. So you just see how the preservation of Noah perpetuated throughout generations and abundance, and also like a covenant, as if one generation continued to take up, right, and have civil disobedience and have that conviction, that moral courage to stick, how then that impacted generations to come. And so this pretty much just confirms that this was a steep pool from the second temple, and this fountain, right, was present from different types in different parts of within history. It was a hidden channel preserved with the same outflow. It was safeguarded. It became a place for priestly water, drawing for the Feast of the Tabernacles. It's also a place where Jesus had commanded the blind man to wash his eyes. He told him to go to the pool of Siloam. Right? So it's also a gently flowing water. So it kind of symbolizes God's quiet and faithful governance. So Shalak was a symbolization of God's faithful governance, and also quiet flowing stream that was sent out among the people, among his generation, right? So what Shalak did was it's encouraging believers to kind of value gentle waters, like the daily grace that he was given, and all of the dramatic things that were going on, especially with the Tower of Babel, and just all the things that were going on, all the idolatry, like all of the evil, all the other covenants and altars. I mean, all the killing. They was just doing, when you talk about, they was doing everything they wanted to do. The rest of his family was doing everything they wanted to do. But however, Shalak, Shalah is another form of the word, was faithful. And it was like the gentle stream that was a constant flowing stream, and pool, and even just the illustration of it then also being later within that same lineage becoming a pool that was used throughout history, just continues to show you about when that consistent faithful governance and stewardship over what you've been giving, how that then will feed generations to come in ways, and kind of set structures in place and infrastructures in place that feed generations to come in different ways. It also showed the practicality of the season of trusting in the season of threat, because of the Tower of Babel and all the other things that were going on. There was so much going on, and how he had to, and his lineage had to continue to trust God in the seasons of threat. Now, Shalak had many children, but his son Aver was chosen. And it means Hebrew. I think a lot of the scholars and things like that just said that it was named, like it meant Hebrew, because he actually became the founder of why the children of Israel were called Hebrews in the first place, like that culture. So Aver is also a patriarch, but was also in the Hebrew, it is a region beyond. It means region beyond, side, other side, across. It signifies a legal marking and boundary that must be crossed, or a passage. So Aver has a geographical use. It also means covenantal boundaries, right? Spiritual decisions, and I'm gonna probably murder this word, but eschatological hope, which just means like future restoration. So you're coming from the other patriarchs, right? And then you're coming out of Shalah, which is like this flowing, consistent of faithfulness. And then now you're going to Aver, which is also like this legal boundary, right? This legal marking of something that must be crossed, right? It's like a passage that must be crossed. Is geographical, like legal boundaries, but then also just the covenantal boundaries of the covenant and of the faithfulness that they had to continue to steward, right? And the spiritual decisions that they had to continue to steward and do despite all of what was going on at that time. And mind you, they're around family, so it's their family. their family is populating the earth, so it's their family. So the rest of their family, the other side of their family, like them second cousins, them third cousins twice removed, they just wrecking, ravaging all of the earth. So it's not necessarily like, oh, they don't belong to us. No, it's their family. It's them crazy cousins. It's that radical auntie. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it is. And so they had to, this generation, right? Because he carried on this lineage. So it came from his generation. So in this generation, that was a part of the covenantal promise, right? Of preserving the remnant. We're talking about remnants, what the remnant is. How do you to even look through generational or just people that that you're connected to in community and look back over the generations of like, okay, and what theme was a part of this generation? Because also what I've known from doing these teachings and doing research, reading the Bible, really studying, not just reading it, but actually studying, getting a deep dive, and then also just reading other journals and texts and things, and just seeing how people in these fields that study and that do deep dives, like how you have to really study it, you see common signs. So what I'm telling you is not just the Hebrew names and not just the definitions, but these are actually signs within the earth that were given. Like, these weren't just spiritual signs. These are also physical signs that God was providing these generations, for each generation that held on to the promise, that held on to these spiritual, faithful, covenantal boundaries. Each generation, it was a sign, and the sign kept going down 10 generations for then Abram to rise up, right? And once Abram rised up, and we'll get into that on Sunday, of like what was given once Abram rised up. So all these faithful covenantal decisions and boundaries that was kept, right? All this civil disobedience and moral courage and conviction that was kept, that was taught in an in-depth, and not just taught, right? It was lived out. So they were not just teaching their next generation, they were living out as they were teaching. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm teaching you so you can know not to do. It was like, no, I'm teaching you so that you can know not to do, but also in this, I know what not to do, and I still have to do what I should be doing and not what I shouldn't be doing, because that is all how this promise, all how the remnant is being able to survive, right? Being left. If they didn't do what they were supposed to do, the remnant would not survive. So they couldn't just teach it and teach the way for the children and the patriarch that would take it forward. They had to live it out too. And mind you, they're living for 400, 500, 600, 700 years. So just think about how many years that is to live faithful when there's all this hectic stuff going around. Your auntie crazy, your cousins is out here trying to build a tower going up to heaven, and they will probably be successful in it. So then they get scattered. Your whole family gets scattered to different ends of the earth. The language gets scattered. So now where you guys were speaking one language, now y'all can't even understand each other, because your cousin's speaking another tongue. Your other cousin that's just your first cousin has a whole different tongue from you. And now you're having to not only communicate, but commune, but then also stay faithful to covenantal boundaries, because you are the remnant that was preserved, that will bring about through generations, through a lineage, a pure lineage, the promise of a savior, a Messiah, right? So each generation there was signs. There weren't just spiritual signs, but these names, as I was going through it, I'm like, okay, these names mean something. And also back in the day, which I don't know more so now in the modern times, because people just name their child anything, but to them it might be, symbolic. But back in those days, the name meant everything. Like your name determined your destiny. And so these names weren't just chosen, just haphazardly. Like, no, these names meant something. And they were also a sign of that generation that was caring for whatever that was for that generation. That was the sign for that generation. And as it was passed on, then that was another sign. And it's just like all these signs of the coming of, I feel like sometimes, when you're healing or when you're going through things. And like even now we can look at the signs of like what's happening politically, what's happening within our communities. People are starving, the whole SNAP thing, people are losing their jobs, the employment, like the housing, like all of these things. Yes, these are things going on, but these are signs. And I think we're taking it for face value of like, people are suffering. Yes, people are suffering. They're always going to suffer because the systems that were implemented before mandated suffering. That was how America was made. America was built upon suffering. So if we really think the United States can somehow circumvent the suffering part, it's really crazy. It's really insanity, because America was built upon suffering. It was built upon oppression. It was built upon labor, like forced labor, enslavement. And so you can't just circumvent that. That was how it was built. So anything that has I think I said in my other teachings, and I say it every teaching, anything that's made has a purpose. It has an origin. Now the origin is not just based on where it was made, the location, the geographic. It was also the origin of like the purpose of why this is made, how it's made, and what it will do because it's made. So when you think about America, when you think about the United States, when you think about some of these other countries where there's so much corruption, where there's so much just everything going on, that's the origin of that country. It was made like that. There were certain systems put in place made like that. So that will continue to perpetuate because that's how it was founded. That's how it was made. So what we're seeing now is just signs. And the thing is, we have to understand and look at the signs as it being a sign of something to come. What is coming? And so that's why I'm trying to get you to understand with these remnants of like, we're just not talking about all these names and just, oh, okay, well, these is 10 generations. No, each generation meant something. Each generation was a sign. The next generation that carried upon the mantle, the next generation that carried upon that boundary, that covenantal boundary, whatever that was another sign. So there's a sign of the times. And that's why I'm saying you have to identify the pharaohs of the times, because with the pharaohs of the times, there's always signs. There are signs. There are things happening. The fire alarm is going off. Maybe the smoke alarm is going off. And we're just like, oh, I'm used to beeping noises. No. These are signs. There is something coming. And when you can identify the signs and identify what the signs are saying, then you have control and you have authority and you have a position now, and your feet are planted in position to be able to know what's happening, how you can circumvent it. You know, if you're someone that prays, how you can pray and know how to pray. If you know what I mean, you just are able to navigate with strategy. And I think that's something that is not really taught. I know it's not really taught in school. It's strategy, and what strategy is and how strategy is implemented, because you can have a strategy plan and you can implement it word for word, but if you don't really know what it is, how you need to utilize it, it won't work. So so each lineage, each patriarch that was chosen, their name means something, and there's also signs of that time, but also there were signs and for generations after them. Because if we think about, when we get to Abram, you think about Joseph, because from Abram to Joseph, there was some time. Moses. And then Moses, Abram needed to do what he needed to do to then set up the rest of his generation and lineage to then do Moses, because Moses was then going to carry them into the promised land, right? So Abraham was like Abraham was the, setting the markers, setting the, like he was the, how like the one that, the pioneer, the one that goes before, right? There's always a pioneer with everything. They go before, they deal with all of the treacherous stuff, right? So that the one that's coming afterwards, that's actually going to put it in action, that's going to lead the people, that's going to do that, they follow the markers of the pioneer. That's what it was. And then from there, Moses, and other people that came down his lineage then just gave way to Jesus Christ. So that's how it is. So we're going to go from Aver. So Aver, what he symbolized was, with his household, it was chosen that all families within this household, within this earth, will be blessed by him. And I think that was also in Genesis 10:21, so you can reference that. But also Aver, what his generation, what his lineage represented, and his patriarch represented, the standard of his patriarch represented the sovereignty of God and electing grace, right? The faithfulness across generations, because again, there was so much going on within their generations, within their family, within what was going on in the world. And there was still faithfulness. Also, the hope amongst global unrest, civil unrest. Again, the Tower of Babel, what that did globally, like what that did within their family, like that just changed everything. I mean, that's how we have all these different languages. Came from the Tower of Babel. They was doing stuff they should not been doing. So while the rest of their family's doing stuff they shouldn't be doing, you have Aver here, who has come from Shalach, who came from Arpachshad, who came from Shem, who came from Noah, which all these people, mind you, are still living. So they're all still living. They're all still being faithful. It's just the rest of their family. The other side of the family you don't talk about. You know what I mean? That side of the family is just out here just being crazy. And so from Aver, Peleg, his son Peleg was chosen as the patriarch to carry on the promise concerning, to carry on the preserving of the remnant, which they're still part of this remnant, right? But the preserving of the remnant that came from them, and also the remnant that was sure to come later, and the bloodline. And so Peleg means division. And this goes back to Genesis 10:25. This also is pretty interesting, because Peleg, through some other texts, they say that Peleg's birth occurs 101 years after the flood that happened, and his death was 230 years later. And so he's really like the bridge. When we talk about division, how it's a bridge, he's really like the bridge between those two eras of judgment, because the flood was a judgment, right? And then the scattering of Babel was another judgment, right? So at this time, he's born within this time, so he's seeing this, he's experiencing the birth of a repopulation of the earth, and the emergence of other tribal nations due to what happened at the Tower of Babel, which resulted in judgment. So because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, like what Peleg and all his other lineage was doing, they were end up being scattered, and so earth was being repopulated. Tribal nations were being born because of the Tower of Babel. So he's really like the bridge in between the flood of what happened, and then also this judgment that happened at the Tower of Babel. And so that's why his name means division. Okay, and it also talks about it in Genesis 10:25, which I have my Bible right here, so let me just pull it up for you. That way I can just read it for you, because it's literally just a verse, one verse. So bear with me. So it says, excuse me. It says, and to Ever was born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. So that's why his name means division. And then his brother's name was Joktan. And then it kind of goes into the Tower of Babel information, which I can actually do another teaching on that, but that'll have to be at a later time. Okay, so Peleg means to divide. So there's 2 root words. So it means to divide or to split, literally or figuratively. It also was a channel and a canal. And it also represents linguistic and cultural splitting and division. i.e. the Tower of Babel, when that happened. And it's also a reiteration of divine judgment of mercy and like sovereign order. So when sovereign order is not in place, or when sovereign order is kept in place, according to Peleg, there's a protective separation that happens when there's sovereign order in place. And there's also a mercy upon the person or upon this remnant through Peleg, which was the patriarch, to carry this on. So there was a protective separation, that happened when divine judgment took place, which is when the people within the Tower of Babel were all spread across the world and their languages was scattered. Also, another root word of Peleg, it means division, stream, channel. It also correlates to divine supply and stability. So even the stability of his lineage, and there was a divine supply in the midst of division. It also speaks to moral channels of governance and disciplined stewardship. So because Peleg continued to be in the sovereign order under those spiritual instructions, it created a channel of governance that was bestowed upon him, because being a patriarch, that's a form of governance. I know now in the world we're like, patriarchy, kill it, you know what I mean? But it's a form, it's a channel of governance, because it comes with disciplined stewardship. And so, well, you have to have disciplined stewardship. Some people don't have disciplined stewardship, and I think that's what we're seeing of years and years of patriarchy being in place, and those people that are appointed within that governance of patriarchy and given that authority, they're not stewarding it accordingly. So that's kind of what we're seeing now, where everyone's like, kill patriarchy, we hate it. But with Peleg, he was given of stewardship, that it was a disciplined stewardship. So he had to be disciplined in what he did. And again, it's a certain lifestyle. Like they had to live a favorable lifestyle. Now, again, this does not mean perfection, but it means holding on, being convicted, and knowing what you're supposed to be doing and following the instructions that you're supposed to be given to follow. That you know that they're by way of covenant, that there's already been a covenant that's established. So through the covenant that was established, there are protocols to withhold the covenant in place. It's like he does his part, you do your part. So Peleg was given that channel of governance of being a patriarchy, and all of these patriarchs that I mentioned, they were given that channel of governance, and through discipline, and also the disciplined stewardship. So also Peleg is representative of corporate grief and brokenness, right? They called it the stream of tears. So the corporate grief and brokenness came again from the Tower of Babel and all of the, I think people talk about it, but I don't think we really dive deep into like the brokenness, the grief of their family. Because again, Noah was still alive, Shem was still alive, all of the patriarchs that I've mentioned before Peleg, they're still alive, and they're looking at their family be torn apart, right? They're looking at how idolatry and how all these other evil practices have infiltrated their family in ways, and have them acting out in ways that are against the covenant that was set before them when it came through to Noah, right? Because he was saved and spared. And so there's a grief that happens with that. I don't know if other people experience a grief when you know you have family members or friends or people within community that it's just like you see them doing things and it's like, can you not do that? Like, I don't want to see you, even though, you say like, oh, consequences are consequences, you still don't want them to suffer like that. Because, I mean, they're still suffering. I mean, they're dying, they're suffering. There's a lot of things going on. And so there's a corporate grief happening when you talk about being under one order where we all speak the same language. We're all family. We're all in an area, to then now every part of the family is being scattered across the earth. New nations are rising, so you have new family you'll never see nor can communicate with because they speak another language that you don't speak. And so there's, the confusion and scatteredness of the linguistics. And also now that they've adopted different cultural practices. So based on, like, they don't even believe the same thing you believe anymore. You know what I mean? Their culture changed. And so that's a whole culture shock going on. So there's corporate grief going on. And they call it the stream of tears at this time of division because even with all of this going on, Peleg and all the other patriarchs before him are still being faithful. They're still, acting as the patriarch, the stewardship, the teacher, but then also living out this life as well. And their stream of tears, right? The tears and the grief. And while they're watching all this stuff happen to their family, they're grieving. It's an act of grieving, watching all this stuff happen. I mean, like, if you were to walk out and see, I'm trying to think of, like, for instance, when I get on social media sometimes, when I do finally get on, or when I watch the news and you hear about, like, all these kids being gunned down, and sometimes these kids aren't even in streets and they're not into street gangs and none of that. Like, it was a kid that was just about to graduate high school, going into college. It was, just like, you hear about that and there's like a grief, because it's like, oh my gosh, this calamity, these things are happening. And so they call it the stream of tears, because they're saying that, through their brokenness, through this corporate grief, the brokenness of also covenant. And when covenant is broken, it's kind of like a marriage. When that's a covenant, when that marriage promise, that trust is broken, there is a grief, right? There is a grief that there's a wailing, there's a wailing that happens. And so that wailing is also, within their covenant to God, is an offering to God, right? And to God's moral order, because it also kind of stems from, like, God, like, we are grieving with what's happening. However, I'm still trusting you. I'm still trusting your divine order. And they also call it lamenting. So they were at this time with Peleg. The sign of Peleg and this patriarchy meant, like, the grieving, the lamenting over the breach of the covenant, right? Because again, Noah is still alive. Shem and all of them are still alive. And so they're all lamenting. They're all grieving over the brokenness of the covenant in regards to the rest of their family. I mean, Noah had kids. Shem had other kids. So just think about, one of my children are chosen. Like, when people talk about, like, oh, I want all my children to go to heaven, or I want all my children to go to college, or like, and I read stories sometimes when people share their testimony of, like, they had 4 kids, but only 1 survived because each other kid had, like, a tragic thing happen to them. Like, that's kind of what's happening. I'm trying to give you that reality sense of, like, they all have different kids. They're not just having one child and that's it. They're all having different children, and one is chosen because one chose to be faithful. So that means that the rest of the kids have fallen off. They're being destroyed. They're being devoured, right? They're not covered under this covenant. They're not a part of, even though technically familial wise, they're within the remnant because they're alive, but they're not under the remnant, because the remnant comes through the faithfulness, and the faithfulness comes through the lineage of one. So yeah. But also in this time of division, Peleg also means stream, right? And channel. So through this stream, though, through this lamenting, through this grief of brokenness, the sign that God is showing them also is his source and supply, that he is their source and he's their supplier. And so the channels all track back to a single river, which is God himself, right? So he is still supplying them. He is still being their source in the midst of everything that is happening within Peleg, within this division, within this corporate grief, within this brokenness, within the breach of the covenant that was clearly stated and taught. And also with this source and this stream and channel, there's the sign of guidance and sovereignty. So, and so it talked about the hearts, and the hearts being ready irrigation ditches. So you know how, like, when water flows, like, you gotta, like, dig the ditch for the water to flow. So it's talking about how they are connecting their hearts to the source and supply, and for God to supply these things, where God is the single river, supplying out and being that stream, like the hearts of man. So the heart of Peleg, the heart of Shem, the heart of Noah, the heart of Archibald, they had to be of irrigation ditches ready to receive the supply, the stream. And so it also talks about, in terms of division, in terms of these patriarchies, we talked about governance, but there's also a heavy weight of responsibility and stewardship. And I don't think that this is talked about, but this kind of shows that, like, in the midst of your brokenness, in the midst of your complete grief, right, in the midst of all these things going on, there is a heavy weight and duty of responsibility and stewardship that you still have to uphold. And he had to uphold. So regardless of the choices of other humans and how they determine, and it said in this, and some of these summaries is coming from the concordance, which I really liked how they just kind of tied it all together. But they were saying that human choices determine whether your channels convey purity or pollution. And so, yeah, so the hearts of their other cousins and brothers, their channels, their irrigation, their ditches, their channels were pollution, you know, and they had Peleg, Shem, Noah, they had a heavy responsibility and stewardship to ensure that their heart conveyed purity throughout all of this. And so the last point of Peleg through all of this is also just that how tears also acknowledge yet an anticipated cleansing. So even their tears, they're heavy lamenting, because it said like they were like lamenting heavy during this period. Their heavy lamenting was also a cleansing for them, and like a cleansing and expectation of the promise of the Lamb. Because, like, you know how you see stuff and you're just like, God, where are you? I think I hear even people that don't believe in God, they be like, God, where are you in this? Like, where are you in this? I cannot see you in this. You see all this is going on. Where are you? Like, that's the kind of lamenting they have. And so those tears, that lamenting, was a cleansing for them, and also just a sign of like, yes, and there is yet still someone to come. Like, God's promise did not fail. And their heavy responsibility and stewardship of maintaining purity also gave and continued the anticipation and the expectation that there was a savior coming, you know, for the things that they saw. So I'm like, this stuff is good, okay? Like, this is good to me. Whoo, this is so good to me. So Peleg had children. But out of his children, Reu was chosen as a patriarch to carry forth this heavy responsibility, this stewardship, right, of purity. And so Reu, there's several meanings and signs of Reu, because again, this starts another generation. So with this generation, with Reu being the patriarch, it means to associate with, to be a friend or companion. And so what Reu, the sign of Reu, meant was the covenant continuing. And also when I kind of read this, I was like, oh, to be a companion or friend. So Reu signified that he was associated and a friend of God, right? A companion to God. And it meant the continuation of the covenant, continuation of the purity of this, and the stewardship and responsibility and governance that given as a patriarch. And also the responsibility of preserving the line, again, because 4 generations, like forward generations, I can't remember, I think it's like, because I think I was doing some lineage research, and I think from David to Jesus it was like David to someone, it was like 40 years, like 40 generations, sorry, not 40 years, 40 generations. I will fact check that, so don't take me on that. But I remember I was looking at some like the lineage charts and things like that. And I remember if it's from Noah to Abram, it's 10 generations. I think, I forgot who it got to, that it was like 40 years and then another, 40 generations and then another, whatchamacallit. But it might have been Moses. I don't know. That'll be another teaching though. But yeah, so he had to preserve, they called it the Messianic line. So he had to preserve that Messianic lineage. Also just divine sovereignty within ordinary lives. I think they talked about Reu, they talked about someone else, because some of these patriarchs, like, they're only mentioned in the scriptures in like this specific way. They might be mentioned in a couple other scriptures, but then for some of them, like there's not much on them though. Like it's just their name and that's it. Like there's or some of them, they just don't have an origin. They don't have, you know, like there's no meaning of their name that was known. And so it's like, okay, but it's like there's something in terms of like the beauty of living a consistent but ordinary life, that how there's still meaning in that, there's still divine purpose, and there's a significance in that. And I think that's also something as part of this lineage, is because some of these lineages, like they don't have definitions, they don't have these wonderful mighty things, but then it's like, but they were still chosen within the lineage, where they didn't have to go slay these dragons and do these things and do these great, you know, pursuits, but they were still valuable, you know. So don't think that just because like you might, you know, look or think that you live a mundane, or that you're not doing some of the big pursuits that you see other people doing, like your life is still valuable. And it's also affirmed that there's still significance and divine purpose with what you're called to do. And sometimes, and for a lot of it, like within this lineage, like just the fact that like, yeah, they didn't do these big pursuits, but they were still chosen as a patriarch, as a chosen vessel to continue to facilitate and steward and preserve the line, the bloodline, the lineage of the most perfect and holy Savior. Like that is lit. Like that. That's all I gotta say. So some other root words of Reu is Rhea, which means neighbor, friend, another. So it just also means brother, companion, fellow, friend, husband, lover, neighbor, another. It kind of signifies God binding his people together, like, and also binding his people to him, again through that covenant and the preservation of that allowed truth, justice, and compassion and love. So his patriarchy, his lineage, this generation really signified the love and companionship of God, and what it looks like to be a friend of God, what it looks like to be really communed and intimate with God. And another root word is Reu, which is good pleasure and will. Another root word is Rei, which is friend, companion, and fellow. They also said Rei also stands, and they gave a complex illustration of pasture. And so Reu wasn't just the companion of God, the friend of God, like the showing the companionship and the compassion and the love, right? The sign of love of God and sign of this preservation and covenant of purity. But it also showed like pasture. And so they talked about different elements and context within history in the Bible when they talked about the sheep and the shepherd, right? Covenantal fulfillment and divine provision. And it talked about the root word of Rei is Ra'ah, which means to shepherd, to tend, to pasture, and to feed. And so pretty much Reu was that. He was the shepherd. He was tending. He was, pasturing and feeding, right? Feeding his generation, feeding the people under him, feeding, the children that he birthed, teaching them in that right way. He was tending to the flock of his family, tending to the flock of his generations, tending to the flock of the generations that were coming up out of, not only him, but also his brothers. So he was tending to them, allowing them to graze on, the fulfillment, the covenant, the teachings, and the divine provision that came from the fulfillment of the covenant. And also it says to associate with or as a friend. And so they kind of illustrated that Rei is talking more of like the ministry of shepherding, providing that continual nourishment for his household, in terms of the covenant, the divine provisions that came because of it, and also just the preparation of the coming of the shepherd, which is Jesus Christ. So it talked about him not only being a friend and companion and someone to commune with, for God to commune with, and allowing himself to be a friend of God, and also allowing the communion between him and God, God through the life that he lived, right? So the application of it. So it wasn't just the administration, because I know when people think about pasturing, farming, being a shepherd, there's an administration to it, right? There's administration to everything, because it's just the systems. But it wasn't just I liked how they said that it's not just the administration of the covenant, because there's, you know, the administration would be like the protocols, like you need to do this in this order, you know, with any covenant that you read in historical text, and also biblical text. When there was a covenant, there was clear instructions, and each instructions had then even more clear, direct instructions that needed to follow. So those is just the administration of the covenant. But for this, for Ra'ah, for what he was doing, for he was like the shepherd, not only the companion and friend of God, and being in communion and communing with God in a way, in a divine way that was bringing of divine provision and fulfillment of the covenant that God had set in Noah. And mind you, Noah and all of them are still alive. Like, I'm going to keep repeating that. Noah and all of them are still alive at this time. But also the parallel to Reu and this generation, and him being the patriarch of this specific generation, was also being the friend of God. Because we start with, I won't even get into that, but the friend of God, but then also the shepherd. By way of his communion, he was able to shepherd his generation accordingly, right? That someone would pick up, another person would then become the patriarch and pick up the patriarchy and continue the lineage, right? So he was pasturing, he was providing that continual nourishment, spiritual nourishment for his household, for his generations, and yeah, and another root word was ra, which was to probably associate with. So it also talked about cultivating. So he was like cultivating and being that company, cultivating and being that companion, that associate, that friend of God, and also showing through his shepherding his generations, and that which the patriarch would be chosen from him, from his children, to carry that on, showing them how to be a companion and friend of God, how to commune with God. So you see, like, how things are just setting up where this was the sign of this generation. Now his son Serug was chosen as the patriarch. So Reu's son Serug was chosen as the patriarch, and he learned from his father how to shepherd, how to provide nourishment, how to be a companion and friend of God, how to continue this covenant, how to continue the divine fulfillment of the covenant, and also the divine, what is it called? Divine, I just said it. Provision, divine provision. So Serug means patriarch, and all of them it just says patriarch under them. But also Serug means tendril. And so for him in this specific generation, in this lineage that he carried on, was just the continuity of God's plan. So when we talk about the remnant, this is the remnant. He saved Noah, right? So he saved Noah because Noah was the remnant. And from Noah, he would then preserve through his lineage, through his generations, the continuation of the remnant that is to come for the promises that he had, right? And so when you talk about remnant, when you talk about generational, when you talk about things that are being passed down, whether it's even through here, you're seeing communion, friendship, companionship, intimacy. So things aren't just passed down by words, by screaming, by yelling. It's also passed down by actions. They were living this. And again, like, this is the time where they still had long lives. So they was like living, 300, 400, 500 years. So this is not just, 60 years of living pure. 60 years of living under this covenant, because you lived to see 80, and 20 of the years you was just like a bat out of hell, wreaking havoc on everyone, and you chose the next 60 years of your life to live pure. That's not, no. They're being raised up in purity. They're being raised up in covenant. So they are being born into covenant. They are being born into purity. Now, of course, yes, sin is still prevalent on the earth, so they also, we are born in sin. But I'm saying, from the moment they're born, based on, again, the shepherding, based on the divine stewardship, based on the responsibilities and who is bearing the responsibility, who is bearing the sacrifice, who is taking that on. They are being taught up in this. And those that listen, those that don't stray, and that one that stays faithful is then being chosen as the patriarch. So it's about Serug being the patriarch is more about faith in the midst of declining, because again, they were living long, but after the Tower of Babel and a little bit of, some other stuff, the vitality of the human life began to decline. So they weren't, like their days are being cut. They're not like Noah and living to 950 years. Like the humanity, the vitality of their life is being cut. And it's decreasing. And so it says that the idolatry rose, and so their lifespans were shortened due to idolatry rising. And so Serug's line, so his lineage, remained distinct. So, that's so good. So it's like all of these lineages had to remain distinct amongst everything that was happening. So like, what is your distinction? Are you a part of a remnant, and what is your remnant's distinction? You know what I mean? Like, what makes you distinct from everything and everyone else that's happening and what's going on? So Serug's, his generation, this lineage had to remain distinct. And so there was a type of heritage that can only survive by God, and that's seen and that's valued in terms of faithfulness. So sometimes, we like to see, again, like I was saying, some of these patriarchies, they didn't have these public exploits and these missions and woo, they did this. Like, some of them was just like, it was like they were faithful. They were so faithful. And there was the value of the unseen faithfulness, because it's different when you look faithful to other people, but behind closed doors, that faithfulness can look very different. But it's the unseen faithfulness, the things that people can't see, and them remaining faithful in the unseen faithfulness is what has more value than the public exploits. And so Serug also talked about intergenerational stewardship, and the mandate of teaching God's work to children and grandchildren. And I think when we talk about remnant, when we talk about residue, when we talk about your promise, your purpose, and things like that, what we do now, whatever we do now, whatever we set up now, whatever we teach now is going to be that of the exploits, and not exploits, but is going to be what our children, our grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren run with. It is a mantle. It is like passing the baton. Have you seen a relay race in track? I used to run track when I was little. And the 4-man relay race. However that first person started was how, and at the pace that not necessarily everyone ran, but it was the position that everyone then fell into. So if that first person did not start strong and was not ahead and was behind, that meant that next person that they passed the baton to was already behind. And so they would have to work and run 2 to 3 times harder to catch up. And then, you know what I mean? So, like, that's what they talk about intergenerational stewardship. What is being taught within Serug and all these other patriarchs is that then which is being carried forth into this next generations and this next lineage. And so thinking about discipleship and what that looks like and how that spans for generations is very important when we're talking about continuing covenants and the continuity of covenants. So Serug was born 187 years after the flood and died 425 years after that. So he lived a pretty, long life. And so this places him in this chronological and genealogical order, and chronology places Abram's birth 2 generations later. So they are so close, this just kind of just stirred something up in me, because it's like they have been faithful for so long that they are so close to the promise. Like, just imagine Noah, what Noah received after the flood, the promise, and still being alive, seeing all this calamity, seeing your family scattered, seeing your family acting crazy, not keeping with the covenant, but knowing that there is one person that is faithful, and because they're faithful, it is being passed down. So the covenant is continuing, and they're so close to the promise. Now, the promise of Abraham was the next step and the next element of the promise, of what was promised, which is Jesus Christ. But there's different things that were, there's different things in history that were set forth before we get to Jesus. So Abraham, which the name was Abram, and then God changed it to Abraham, he was like that first iteration of promise and fulfillment of promise, right? So they're like just they're like two generations from Abram. Yes, literally 2 generations. You're 2 generations off from your promise. You're 2 generations. Like, if you just keep the faith, if you just stay consistent, if you just stay committed, if you just stay with your, those convictions, and you stay distinct and live a life of distinction, you are just 2 generations. Now, you might not be 2 generations. You might be 2 months. You might be 2 years. You know what I mean? You are just so close to the promise. And mind you, Noah, Shem, and them are so close to seeing the promise being fulfilled, seeing an element of the promise being fulfilled. Now, though they didn't live to actually see Jesus Christ being born generations down the line, them being able to see a promise, a part of the promise, which was Abraham being born and what Abraham fulfilled, 2 generations off from a promise, okay? So, I'm sorry. Yeah, sarug also comes from the root word sarag. And sarag means to intertwine and to weave. So this generation, not only just the things that I mentioned, but this was really just a generation of intertwining and weaving. Now, there was in the concordance, they got really deep into the intertwining and the weaving. I just didn't want to spend too much time with it, but pretty much it was like the wrapping together, the wreath. It talked about, and there's an illustration of the 2 truths of power that was happening at this time, right? Because we're still kind of in the midst and the aftermath of the Tower of Babel. And so there's 2 truths warring at this time of power. So you have the strength of God, which is continuing throughout these lineages of patriarchs that I've mentioned, right? So that you have that truth of power. Then you also have the power of penalty, which they're seeing being played out with the Tower of Babel, with the destruction, with all the things that are going on with their other family, the languages being scattered, the new nations, the new tribes that are rising, all this stuff and all this other destruction, things like that. So there's the power of God, meaning the strength of God, happening through this covenant, through this purity, through the lineage, and they're just two generations off of the promise. And then you also have the power of penalty and the power of judgment that's happening, where there's the bondage of sin, right? And what that is birthing into the earth, where it's a continuance of bondage of sin, and they're seeing their family being in bondage to the sin, and what that's producing. But sarag is the intertwining and the weaving. And they talked about in the weaving of I forgot what they called it, but they were talking to a specific type of weaving historically back in that day. There was a specific type of weaving technique that they used, that once they weaved it, that thing was locked in. It was, you could not unweave it. You could not, how sometimes when you sew, or if you don't sew, when you sew, sometimes how if you make a mistake, you can just take a little thing and pick out the thing. It wasn't like that. You could not do that. So it was showing and illustrating the strength and the power of God, and how he's intertwining and interweaving and locking in this generation, locking in also all the patriarchs, but this generation, locking in and intertwining his power, his promise, and his fulfillment and provision, and interweaving this lineage, this generation, into the promise, into his covenant. And so from sarag, Nahor, his son, was chosen to be the patriarch. So Nahor means snore. And so again, this is one of the two generations. So Nahor is the grandfather of Abram. Now Nahor is also a pivotal name. And if you're not careful, you might mistake it, because Nahor was the grandfather of Abraham, but he was also, he wasn't the brother, but Abraham's brother was named Nahor. So, but this one who we're talking about is the grandfather of Abraham. And so they talked about how that Nahor embodies this generation, mind you, because it's like there's one more generation and then Abraham's born, and that's the seed of promise, right? He's going to be rised up. Like, there's a great promise and prominence of what he was called to do, to take this remnant into the next phase, right? So there's this tension, right? And like, it's almost like whenever you get close to something, I don't know if you ever have, like, when you're healing, or you're getting close to a breakthrough, or you're just getting close to, like, even like a problem that you cannot solve, and you're just like, I'm getting close to the answer. There's this tension that's in the air, and you don't know if it's good tension or bad tension. You just feel tension, and you're just like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, it's like this wrestling tension, right? So that's what they were saying, like the Nahor was like this wrestling tension between election and common grace. So they essentially, his descendants, right, became essential for the unfolding of God's plan, i.e., his son that took up the patriarchy, and then Abraham, and then, just the rest of the descendants that came down the line. And that was proving divine sovereignty, right? That kind of harmonized the dispersion and then also reunion. So it was like this tension of divine sovereignty that kind of culminated the dispersion, right? So there was already a division, there was a separation, there was a dispersion that happened due to what is it called? Sorry, having a brain fart. Due to the responsibility and the stewardship of the covenant, right? But then there's also this like reunion that is taking place, and it kind of started with Sarag, right? With the interweaving, the interlocking, the intertwining. So then God is like creating this reunion with him in this part, and that, even though there was a separation, and when you talk about separation, it's not just within their family, but just within the earth, within humanity. There's this huge separation between, the covenant and God, and like the people outside of the people that were faithful. And so, Nahor signified this sanctified return. So it was like God was with Sarah, God was reuniting his people to him, intertwining things like that. And Nahor was like this sanctified return, that though Adam and Eve started this great separation of humanity from God, that God was intertwining and interweaving them back to him. And then Nahor was the one that signified in the generation. It was the sign of that time of the sanctified return, the return of us to God, the return of communion, the return of us back to our rightful authority, place of authority. And also, this also perpetuated again the coming of the Messiah, which is Jesus, which happened generations later. Interesting enough, Nahor also becomes a city, becomes a place, and the city is actually linked within the lineage. I'm not going to go into detail because there's so much, and I don't want to confuse you, but it also becomes a city. So Nahor is the grandfather of Abraham. The brother of Abraham was also named Nahor, right? So this monumental patriarch had so many like signs and just so many things connected to him. So he was the grandfather, so he was literally the second generation from the promise being fulfilled of a deliverer rising up, right? Being raised up out of that lineage. And then also Abraham's brother was named Nahor. And then Nahor also became a city that was in connection and linked to their lineage. And that was used throughout the time of their descendants. And so, yeah, he's again, like that separation that was happening. He is the sign of reunion, the return. And so they did return to that city in different aspects throughout history. And so another root word is nakar. Nakar is the root word. That's where it comes from. And it means to snort, to snore, or breathe heavily. A snorting or nostril snorting. And so with this, now I know that does not sound like sanctified return and reunion and this beautiful thing, but there's also a duality to everything. So every patriarch I've mentioned, there has been great things said, but there's also been the duality of like the doom and the judgment that's happening, right? Because again, there's two powers at play, right? The strength of God, the power of God, and also the power of punishment, right? The power of penalty and judgment due to the separation that's happened, right? And the breach of covenant with all of their other descendants and families. And so and they also gave illustration about this. I didn't necessarily type it in here because I just felt like it'd be a lot and it might be confusing, but pretty much the snorting of the nostrils, they referred it to the horses. So back in the days, the horses, it's like a certain grunt or a certain like snort that they would do, but it meant war. Like it meant that horse was ready for war. Like there was a coming of a judgment. There was a coming of a war. And so there was a certain like snorting sound that the horses would make. And that would alert the people as a sign like, oh, war is on its way. Because when the horse got to that snort, it wasn't like, oh, war is going to happen in a couple days. Like it was like, no, war is here. And so with Nahor, he meant the reunion, right? The return. And it's also a city, so that was used throughout his descendants and lineage. And so it was a place that they returned to in different ways. But also, again, there's this tension that's happening with the grace, but also with the judgment, right? That power of judgment and penalty and bondage. So with the bondage, there's also an impeding judgment that's happening. Again, whenever there's a deliverer, whenever there's someone rising up with power that God has appointed or that has been appointed to power, there's not just the yay, the hooray, the I know that people usually feel like, oh my gosh, finally someone stepped up. But there's also, that means when they rise to power, there's an impeding judgment coming as well. So everything that they are addressing, they're talking against, everything that they are coming for, they're coming for what they were called to do. They were also calling to rectify. So there's also an impeding judgment, a war that will happen. And so the parallel to this return and things like that, and this great return also means a great judgment, an impeding judgment in war. And so by this heavily breathing, snorting ish sound that this horse makes is a sign that war is here, that judgment is here. And so it kind of illustrated the power and vulnerability of the deployment of that when it comes to the warning, right? The audible signs, and how they kind of talked about there's signs, and I'm breaking down the signs of what each generation, each lineage meant. And these are spiritual signs, these are physical signs, but they were talking about also like the audible signs, the signs in nature, where even nature, like a horse, like even nature, animals, like all of that, there are audible signs, there are visible signs that something is happening, right? And so it says about how history testifies to the Lord, and that the Lord that sustains creation and governs the nations. And so you're seeing that parallel of creation, of animals, of plants, of things and signs happening in the earth that testifies to the power of the Lord, and showing his might in not only sustaining creation so that they could testify, but also in how he governs the nations to bring about judgment, right? And so also just like the human response, they were talking about this signified the human response, right? When you talk about the dispersion and the reunion and the sanctified returns that comes from separation, there's like just a human response of submission. Even in like when it comes to war, there's always like a human response of submission. Usually like they're calling for whether it's repentance or just like whatever was separated to just be returned. And so there's always like a human reaction to war judgment. And so that's what Nakor, his generation, his lineage symbolized. Now we have T-Rock. So we have T-Rock and then we have Abram. So we are literally almost there. And this is how the remnant is being preserved. So out of Nakor's sons, T-Rock is chosen. T-Rock is chosen. Now he is the father of Abraham, right? And T-Rock is also, just like Nakor was a place, T-Rock is actually a place in the desert. And they said that T-Rock was... or was it Nakor? Hold on. I believe that T-Rock was, yes, it was a place in the wilderness. So, you know, like we're going to get to that. The children of Israel being in, not in this teaching, but another teaching, the children of Israel being in the wilderness for 40 years. So T-Rock was one of the wilderness campsites that the children of Israel were in. Now, mind you, the children of Israel are descendants from T-Rock, our descendants from Noah, our descendants from Abraham. This lineage that I'm talking to you about, this remnant that was saved from destruction and calamity of the earth, that's where the children of Israel come from. So they are of the remnant that was saved from years past. And so T-Rock ended up being one of the wilderness campsites that they were camped around about it during the time they were in the wilderness. But that's, again, a descendant. And also showing you in how this stewardship, how this responsibility ends up being monumental markers in time, in places, and in seasons, in history within your descendants that you don't even know will be used later on. You just, you know, if you continue to be faithful in it, it becomes a marker of not just, of prominence, but also a marker that your descendants will return to. And be used. And so T-Rock was the father of Abraham. Now, again, they had a whole lot of idolatry going on. So, So it says that despite the idolatry, God had called Abram. But in the land that they were living in, because they were living in Ur, which is Ur the Chaldeans. And so there was just a lot of idolatry. There was a lot of when I say like a lot of other deity worship, all of the things you can think about, like there was a lot of that. But despite any of that, because the lineage had been pure, there was the patriarch that was pure, that was faithful, and that preserved those teachings, that preserved that way, God still chose Abram, which came from T-Rock. And T-Rock actually died in Haran. So they were told, right? Well, he was told to move, right? So he moved, and they were actually supposed to go to the land of Canaan. And so they were in Ur, the Chaldeans, and like this was like a rich nation too. They had like wealth and prominence, and they were told to go to Canaan. So T-Rock took Abraham, because I believe one of his sons had died, I think one of his sons had died. So he took Abraham, his other son, and their wives, because at this time Abraham was married to Sarah. He took them, and they journeyed was going to the land of Canaan where they were supposed to go, because there was that, like, the land of Canaan. So taking them out of Ur, God needed them out of Ur because there was so much idolatry, and so like the path and the journey to Canaan would start the commissioning of Abraham. Now, mind you, Abraham is already born, and even though we're in the generation of Terah, Abraham is born, but the journey to Canaan would start that of his commissioning, of him being rising up as like this next patriarch that would take on this journey, that would prepare for the remnant to come, right? The descendants of the remnants to come from his lineage. And so they were told to go to Canaan. Now, they got 555 miles from Ur, which was in Haran. And Terah, which is Abraham's father, died in Haran. Like, he did not make it to Canaan. I did read a lot of different texts, and it said, like, people think, like, oh, he got comfortable there, or just, how sometimes you get complacent. But he was supposed to go to Canaan, but he did not make it to Canaan. He died in Haran. However, Abraham was still told to go to Canaan. So Abraham still had to journey to Canaan without his father. And so Terah, there wasn't really much on him, but they were just saying in synopsis, like, what this sign of his generation really utilized or really talked about, because they really just talked about the idolatry that was so present and prevalent where they were. And so they were just saying that, like, the faithfulness and the grace that we talked about was prevalent when it came to the plan and the redemptive plan of, we talk about, Terah's father, how there was a redemptive plan of joining, of merging, a reunion, and like how God still perpetuated that redemptive plan even in the midst of idolatry within the household, and how God still chose his son Abram to continue forward. And they also talked about partial obedience. And so they were told to go to Canaan, right? And Terah went, but he didn't go to Canaan. He stopped in Haran and he died there. So they were saying, like, this is also a sign of, like, what happens when you have partial obedience and complacency. So he began the journey but stops. And so Abraham ends up completing the journey to Canaan in response to the commandment that God gave. So Terah did not complete it. And so he ended up dying, where he settled and where he fell short at. And Abram still had to continue that journey. And it talks about how also, like, and this is a coinciding thing when we talk about the remnant and how this remnant of people were saved. It talks about how, like, family leadership shapes future generations. And so even though Terah died and didn't make it to Canaan, right, there might have been some complacency there, still his willingness to actually leave Ur, which is like where they were from, like their home, support, and make the journey, then still provided that type of leadership that Abram, his son, could still follow after, and to then complete and obey the Lord to go to Canaan, because Terah left their city that they were from. So even the small things of, like, you leaving or you doing those small things, it might seem inconsequential, or you might even feel like you have more consequences than doing it. But in just seeing that how he left and his willingness to leave, though he didn't complete and do exactly what he was told to do, and he stayed in a city, ended up dying there, that willingness to leave gave the courage for his son Abram to do the same and to actually then complete the mission of getting to Canaan. And so then, we have Abram. So that's how woo, that was long, but I'm like, that's how we get to Abram. When you ask, like, okay, what does Abraham have to do with the children of Israel? Like, how is Abraham a part of the remnant? Like, how does all of this tie in together? How did we even get here? What about Joseph? What about the children of Israel? Like, what about all that kind of stuff like that? You have to start at the beginning in Genesis, about when the fall of man, the fall and authority of humanity, of man, and what that perpetuated was bondage and sin, and God needed to preserve. And so that came through Noah, and through Noah's obedience, then that lineage, that purity, that covenant was continued, and they continued to see the provision of God and the fulfillment of the covenant, and the faithfulness continued 10 generations into Abraham, which would then take up the mantle of the next part of the, like, the big, I don't know what to call it, but it's like, you know, like the part of the promise that needed to be fulfilled. And so that is how Abraham fits into this. And I did look up Abram's name. It means high or high father, or exalted father. He's also the one that marks Israel's national identity and plan for redemption, as when we're talking about the remnant and why the remnant was saved, why the remnant is the leftover, the survivors, right? And how he made the journey from Ur to Haran, and then to Canaan, where he was told to go. And from Canaan, he was commissioned and called by God. Now, I also did, because in the last live teaching, we talked about Joseph and how what Joseph did gave way to Moses, who then rose up as a deliverer, right? Because Joseph was a deliverer and also rose up, but he rose up in a time because he needed to have favor with Pharaoh because the famine was coming, right? So still part of the remnant, still a part of the lineage. So how we get from Abram to Joseph in connection to the live teaching is because Abram had Ishmael and Isaac, right? From his son Isaac that was chosen, Isaac had Jacob and Esau. Now, remember Jacob from the last teaching I told you, he was chosen. Jacob was chosen to be Israel. That's how we get the children of Israel. That's how we get Israel, the nation, right? But the nation of Israel came from Abraham, and what Abraham was called to do. And Abraham was pretty much told that he was going to be the father of many, right? So, a lot. So that's how, like, the identity of the nation of Israel became a nation. So through Jacob was named Israel because he became the lineage marker of where the children of Israel would come from. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, right? So Dan, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Asher, Joseph, Benjamin, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. So this then became the tribes of Israel. Well, we talked about how Pharaoh was dealing harsh with them in the live teaching. And you think, well, how'd you get the 12 tribes? This is from the 12 tribes, right? So from Abram came his son Isaac. Isaac was chosen. From Isaac, his son Jacob was chosen. Now Jacob marked from his life, his lineage would then be the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Which would be also in part of the promise that God told Abraham by making him a father of many. And yeah, so Jacob ended up having 12 sons. They became the 12 children of Israel. Within the live teaching, those are the ones that Pharaoh dealt harshly with them. They rose up, they were mighty, they were all these things. Well, you understand now why they were so mighty, why they were such a why they were such a strong calling on their life, why they were so mighty, why nothing could break them, nothing could break their identity. Their identity came through God, which came through Abram. So the identity of Israel was set when God gave the covenant and gave the promise to Abraham about what he would be. That is when that marked the identity. That was the identity marker of the nation of Israel. Now, Jacob being called Israel because that is where Israel was being birthed from. So those 12 sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel is where Israel was being birthed from, right? And so his son Joseph, which we did talk about because we talked about Joseph being called as the Joseph being called as a deliverer. Now, when we talk about it, Noah was called as a deliverer, right? You have Abram called as a deliverer, as like a commissioner, right? Now you have Joseph, which comes from Jacob, right? The father of the children of Israel, like that started it. Now, Joseph was called to be the deliverer, and I talked about in the live teaching of how he had favor with that Pharaoh. And I'll get more into that because that's a whole separate live teaching, but I kind of give a recap of how they even got into Egypt. How they even got into like the Pharaohs in the first place. Or, was in Egypt anyway, to be harshly dealt with by Pharaoh. And so, Joseph was raised up due to Abram's obedience, due to Isaac's obedience, due to Jacob's obedience, and just the favor and grace and mercy of God. Joseph rose up to be the deliverer. Now, he was sold into slavery, as I did in the other recap. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. So the other 11 brothers he had, they sold him into slavery. And end up then, pretty much getting to Pharaoh from that place. But that needed to happen. And why that happened, though that seemed so horrible, was because there was actually a famine getting ready to come that was going to last. There were 7 good years and then 7 years of complete famine, like the worst famine you could think of. And so he needed that so that he could, and like there's a journey, and again, that's another live teaching, so I'll go through that journey, but pretty much he got the favor of Pharaoh, right? Where he was then placed in a position to then move his family within a place of prominence that, again, preserved and kept the remnant, preserved them so that they survived. So when everyone else was dying, everyone else was hungry and selling themselves to Pharaoh's property to eat, the remnant of the people that was chosen through this lineage that I just went through was kept and preserved. They were left over, right? They were the residue left over, preserved and survived and saved for a purpose. And so from Joseph, so from Joseph, his son Levi is chosen for, and we're just talking about how we get to Moses, because right after Joseph, it has the children of Israel being, again, in the live teaching, the last live teaching, have them in Egypt, harsh labor, and then the killing of the sons, right? So we talked about how Pharaoh was coming for the promise. Well, there was a promise of a deliverer coming. Now, the deliverer was Moses, and I talked about that. Now, Pharaoh was trying to kill the boys because of how strong they were. And just the men and women were so strong, and he thought that they would overtake him and overturn Egypt because of how strong they were. Now, they were strong because there's a promise in their life. They're strong because they're the remnant. They're chosen by God. So there was a supernatural strength. They had everything that they needed. And so Moses was getting ready to be born. That was the promise of a deliverer, which is Moses. So how we get to Moses from Joseph, and what Joseph did by saving them because of the famine and having the favor with Pharaoh, that then moved his whole family, moved all his family to Egypt, was Joseph's son Levi. Now, out of Levi, his son Kohath was chosen. And then from Kohath, his son Amram was chosen. And out of Amram, that's where Amram gave birth to Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. And so Moses was chosen to be the deliverer. And his mom, based on the midwives not listening to Pharaoh and killing the boy babies, Moses' mom was able to save his life so that he could rise up as a deliverer. And Aaron, his brother, helped him because he was the appointed priest. And that then goes into another, teaching and several teachings. But that is how lineage, that is how we get to the remnant. So when we talk about the Pharaoh, this specific Pharaoh, and even on Sunday we'll get into the case study of Abraham temporarily in Egypt and that Pharaoh, and how that specific Pharaoh at that time was so greedy and how he was coming to ravish the remnants. It wasn't just the remnant of Abraham, which was his wife Sarah, and like what that was. It was also just the remnants at that time. Like when I was reading, like he was just collecting concubines like Pokemon cards. And it was a famine. I mean, there was a famine going on in the land, and he was just ravishing like every part of remnant, anything left over, any residue of anything they had, he wanted. And so yeah, so this Pharaoh and every Pharaoh is coming to acquire something. So that's how you know when there's acquisition, when there is an acquire, we mean to get something, like there is a Pharaoh near. You can almost guarantee there's a Pharaoh. The Pharaohs are coming to acquire. So this Pharaoh was coming to acquire, and he wanted to acquire the remnant. He wanted all of it. And by him acquiring the remnant would then also derail the destiny and promise. So if you think about it, again, we'll get into it tomorrow, but by him acquiring whatever was a part of the remnant that God needed to continue the protection and the survival of the remnant for the purification of the bloodline, whatever, if Pharaoh would have been able to get away with acquiring that, it would have derailed the promise of a Messiah and a deliverer and all these other deliverers that the Lord rose up within this lineage. But then it also would have also derailed the destiny of the remnant that was chosen. And so, yeah, you can think about that in your life. You can think about how you're a remnant if you're still remaining, if you're part of a small group or quantity of something that is still remaining. If you foresee or know someone, whether it's people or groups or just things that like, oh, there's a remnant, there's something left over here, there's some residue left over from here. Sometimes we think about residue in healing, and it's like the residue is the bad part, like you don't want it. But in this, you have to think about what residue is being left over, what residuals is being left over, what trace has been left over that I can trace back to see, okay, no, this is a remnant. This was saved. This survived for a reason. This was not derailed. This was not delayed. This was not overturned. This was not overtaken for a reason. What do we see in this earth? What do we see in this society? What do we see in this time or even years prior? That there was something that was saved. There was something that was left over. There was something that survived. What is that? What remnant is that? What purpose does that remnant have? There's a reason why. And so that I wanted to just go over this about the remnant part, because in order for you to really get into the deep teaching that we're going to get in the case study, you have to understand the remnant, how the remnant came to be, why specifically the children of Israel and the lineage and descendants of Israel and the nation of Israel, like why are they like the cornerstone of all these stories and all these case studies. Like you have to understand what that looks like, and also what that looks like for you, what that looks like for your life. And so, yeah, we are done with the live teaching for today. I love it. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed it. Tomorrow, I don't know how long the live teaching is going to be. And that's why I broke it up, because I'm like, this is a long, this is a heavy, this teaching, I mean, all my teachings have weight. But this one has a lot of weight. It has a lot of complexities. And all of them do. They all have complexities. They all have layers. I'm like, but when I was sitting with this and doing it and things like that, I'm like, yeah, this. So I was like, again, what we went over with the remnant and the generational lineage and like the importance and the signs and knowing the signs of what each generation, which each lineage means. And this is not just generation within your family. Because yes, that generation that I mentioned they were all family, but it was the generation as a whole, because though they were family, again, they were scattered. So they end up making different tribes and different nations and things like that. So they were family, but they were like far off family. You know what I mean? And really new tribes, new nations. It's like, I mean, they were kind of still in the bloodline, but not really. And so this was like, when you think about generation, like, so like millennial, that's a generation, right? So all the millennials is a generation. You got to think about the context of, yeah, your family lineage, but think farther out in the generation when it comes to the context of everyone within the generation. All the millennials, like there's a certain time frame, of birth between this date and this date. This is what you're called. Yeah, there's certain signs there's certain signs. And then even as it goes to the next generation and more generations are emerging, there's still signs, and the signs of your generation tie into the signs of the next generation. So as we're seeing things progress in generations, and I know people talk about Gen Z and all these other generations about how they are and their work ethic and their lazy and just all these things, I'm like, okay, if we say that that's what they are, or even if they're not, that's what they are, but that's our opinion of them, I'm like, where did that come from? Because again, as I showed you through this lineage, there was a lot going on, but there was still the faithful few that kept to the covenant, that kept to the protocol. So my thing is like, where have we laxed on our protocols? Where have we laxed on our standards that within one generation or within 4 generations, we think that, oh, it just dissipates? No, it continues. So whatever happened in the baby boomer generation that they laxed on, that they had no standards for, that they had no convictions for, that they had no authority for, yeah, it's going to show up in Gen X. It's going to show up in Gen Z. It's going to show up in some of these generation that are babies right now. It's going to show up in that generation. It's going to show up in a way that's worse because it was not handled in the baby boomer generation. And so these things continue. It's lineage. It's called lineage for a reason. It's a line. A line continues. A line never breaks. A line only breaks if we allow it to. But lines intersect. Like if you ever, like, I know y'all took geometry. I hated it. But the only thing I liked about geometry is like the teacher that I had, he would talk about the lines, and he would always say as a way like it help us. And I think this is geometry. Ooh, forgive me if I'm wrong. But he would say a line is continuous. A line will never stop unless you allow it to, and then you would have to literally put a barrier in order to stop a line. But other than that, a line is continuous. It never ends. He was like, lines intersect, lines can become parallel to each other, but a line never ends. So think about generational as a line, not just your family, but we talking about, again, the baby boomers. Whatever generation before the baby boomers started, right? That was the start of the line of wherever, however, that's how far back I'm going to go. But whatever happened in that generation, it's a line. It just continues down the generation. So the generation before the baby boomers, whatever happened then that they did not take care of, that they did not steward and have the stewardship, they did not carry the conviction of the weight of responsibility for, and stewardship and steward things properly, it just continued to baby boomers. And it's like, so the things that we see in these new generations that we don't like are the things that we didn't steward accordingly in these past generations. And all it is continuing, but it's getting worse, because when you think about new generations rising, that is a new sign, right? Certain generations, they carry certain mantles, they carry certain like about themselves, like certain characteristics, because they're being birthed for a certain time. There's a certain sign. And so as I was going through these generational things, you see that each generation, each patriarch that was chosen, their name was chosen for a reason, because it all intertwined within this promise and this prominent promise. And so each generation that rose up, there was signs, there was characteristics, there was, of course, things going on, but there are certain characteristics about this generation because it all pertained to a sign. So we're seeing some of these negative things we don't like, or we're just saying we don't like. However, it's based on your lack of stewardship. And I say you are because we are a generation. So it's not just, oh, well, I'm a part of that generation, but I don't do that. No, generation is generational. It's as a whole. It's as a whole. There's no, no, as a whole, the generation did not handle that. So now it is continuing, and it's getting worse, but also it's continuing on top of a new generation being born, and they're being born for such a purpose and for a time, and there's certain signs and characteristics that they're being born with, because they're meant to handle something, they're meant to carry something, they're meant to build and develop something for the next generation to take a hold of, but they're also building on faulty ground, they're building on faulty systems, they're building on things, altars, idolatry, they're building on things that were not diligently stewarded the generations before. So that's why it looks horrible. So yeah, and knowing if you're a remnant and knowing you're a part of a remnant, knowing like what is the remnant, what's surviving, what promise is, what prominence is, what's swiping that, what's smiting that, what is standing in the way of that, what pharaohs have already risen or are at this time rising up against that specific promise. Why are they trying to ravish your remnant? Like, what is the prominence of your remnant? What is the promise of it? Knowing this will help you see that and see it from a generational lens as your generation as a whole. And it'll also allow you to see the patterns of generations before you to understand, okay, because this is the remnant and this might be the promise, they did this, but they didn't do this. And so they were meant to do this. There was a sign that like, this is what this means. And, you know, understanding that will help you understand the Pharaoh and to identify the Pharaoh that's coming to ravish the remnant. And why the Pharaoh's always trying to ravish the remnant, the surviving, the remaining thing, that residual, that residue that is left for a reason to carry out a certain thing. It's all a part of the promise. So, but I think this was such a good teaching. Like, chef's kiss. I am so full off of this, and this is like the second time I've been doing, like, hearing this stuff again. And live teachings are already uploaded on this page, so you can just scroll through. And if you're like, oh, I just want something a little and you don't want to scroll through some of the content, because a lot of times there's content that corresponds with the teaching, and so I'll post content leading up to the teaching because it's all a part of it, and it's kind of breaking down the teaching of what we're getting ready to talk about in a way, and giving you piece by piece, so that when you actually get to the teaching, it's like, here we go, you know what I mean? So yeah, but you can also watch the replay, catch the replay on the YouTube channel. All of those links will be linked in the comment section. Feel free to also comment and let me know, was this teaching helpful to a lot of the questions that I asked. Let me know if you've have pondered upon the questions and what you have identified. I would love to know, what has come of you thinking about the remnant, thinking about pharaohs, thinking about life and society with these prominent figures and things, and what governance really is, because again, it's spiritual, there's a physicality to it, because of course they need a body. That's kind of what we talked about in the last teaching. Like, Pharaoh's just a body, they need a human body, but it's all spiritual. And so from that place of spirituality, and that altar forms governance and forms power, and how power is assumed, how power is given, how power is transferred, and also how power is sustained. And so yeah, let me know your thoughts on all of this, about the governance, about the pharaohs, or just anything you've thought about in terms of anything that has been said. Feel free to watch all the other previous live teachings. Thank you for tuning in, and this was fun, and I will see you Sunday. Bye.